numbers are still up in the air. The BBC reporting this morning that with 5 of the 500 of 650 results known, the Conservative Party holds the largest share, but not yet a majority. A hung parliament is likely, as it's not clear yet which party will emerge with a majority to form a government. For the latest, we will join BBC Live now for the latest election results.
Into the conduct of the election after hundreds of voters were turned away from polling stations.
Well, let's have a look at the figures for you as they stand, and they'll just come up on that big screen there. Conservatives, they'll come up any minute, I promise you. 290 if they don't. Conservatives 290, Labour 247, the Liberal Democrat 51. So there are still 35 seats to declare, 615 have declared.
I bet we can show you the big screen now. We were just too fast for the screen, I think. So Labour have lost 85 seats, the Liberal Democrats have lost 6, the Conservatives have gained 91. Let us get this report on what a hung parliament means from our chief political correspondent, James Landale.
February 1974, the last time an election ended up with a hung parliament. The Conservative Prime Minister Ted Heath won more votes than Harold Wilson's Labour Party, but fewer seats.
This is turning out now to be a very narrow election result indeed, absolutely into injury time, I suppose one might say.
Over the weekend, Ted Heath sat tight in number 10, as was his right as the sitting Prime Minister, and considered his options. Outside, a young fellow told us what they were.
The man who asked the country to give him a strong majority for the next 5 years has been inside this House all day trying to decide whether he can or should or will or won't carry on the government.
In an attempt to hold on to power, Heath tried to form a coalition with the Liberal leader Jeremy Thorpe, who was summoned to Downing Street for urgent talks.
And here is the Queen now.
The Queen flew home from Australia to deal with the crisis. Then, as now, her role was to stay out of the politics and invite whoever could command the confidence of the Commons to become Prime Minister. By day 4, Ted Heath's attempts to form a coalition were doomed.
The Liberal Party has decided today that it is unable to join such a coalition. I have therefore tendered my resignation and that of the government to Her Majesty the Queen.
Instead, the Queen invited Harold Wilson to form a government, and he chose not to try to forge a coalition, but run the country with what's called a minority government. In other words, doing day-to-day deals with other parties to get legislation through, and relying on them not to force a new general election. 8 months later, Wilson went to the country again, and this time he won a majority of 3. The hung parliament of 1974 might seem like another world, but the essential principles, the role of the Queen, the range of options open to the leaders and the prospect of a further election remain the same today.
That's all I have to say for the moment. This is David Dimbleby in Downing Street.
As we were saying earlier, hasn't aged a day, has he, David Dimbleby?
And he's still got the coat, I bet. I'm sure it seemed very cool in 1974. Right, let us now speak to Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's Chief of Staff from mid-90s right the way through. What should happen now if you were advising Tony Blair's successor, Gordon Brown?
My first advice would be to have some sleep, to think about things carefully and not to rush into anything. The most sensible thing that has been said so far this morning is to take it slowly, think about it. We haven't had this experience for a long time. There are no obvious precedents. It could go horribly wrong, so take your time.
OK, Constitution, as we know, dictates that the incumbent Prime Minister has the opportunity to form a government first. So who will his first phone call be to? Who should he be calling now?
Well, I have no doubt he'll be trying to speak to Nick Clegg, and Nick Clegg will be thinking about what he's going to say to both of the leaders.
Yes, the difficulty, I suppose, as far as the Liberal Democrats is concerned, is Nick Clegg was saying, we don't want to prop up the losing party.
Yes, but he's in a quite nice position. If the numbers work out that he could form a coalition with either side, if that happens, then he'll be the one who can choose. They have to dance with him.
Yeah, would it have legitimacy in the eyes of the public? And this is about public opinion as much as it is about constitutional proprieties. The idea of Labour who've kind of lost a whole load of seats, the Liberal Democrats who've lost seats and seen, that they are then deciding the shape of the next government.
Well, that's the rules. It's the same in Germany, for example. If the FDP wants to, they can switch votes between the CDU, the Conservative Party, and the Socialist Party. The rules are that it's the numbers to win in the House of Commons, and that's what you have to get. Those are the rules, and those are the rules that have to be followed.
Conservative leader, as we know, David Cameron, saying Labour does not have a mandate to run the country, based on what we've seen so far. So do the Tories, as they do have more votes and more MPs than any of the other main parties?
Well, it comes down to who can form a coalition. If Labour can form a coalition, they can govern under the rules that govern Britain. If they can't, and if the Liberals form a coalition with the Conservatives or support a Conservative minority government, then that's what will happen.
What's your best bet as to who's going to be Prime Minister?
Well, I think pretty much all my bets so far have been completely wrong, so I'm not sure
So
that I would
just give us,
make any more.
give us one more wrong bet then.
Well, if I was Nick Clegg, I would think quite hard about how to form a government like this, because there will be another election, presumably within a year or so, and he'll want to think about how he positions himself for that, and therefore he'll think quite hard about what message the electorate has sent when he forms a government, or allows a government to be formed.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean that he wouldn't actually go into any form of government or agree to support the Conservatives, who just sit back and wait until there's another election
He's in a
later
very
on in the year?
comfortable position at the moment. He can decide what he does, and he'll be thinking, I assume, about the next election and how he positions himself for that.
And what would you have been doing if you were still in Downing Street today? Would you be speaking to the palace and kind of trying to reassure them and trying to...
No, I was a political appointee. I'd have been chucked out, quite rightly, or at least but in the election campaign itself. But you'll have Peter's Golden Triangle happily working away with Jeremy Hayward, the Queen's Private Secretary, and Gus O'Donnell. We're back to the 1970s and the time of Yes Prime Minister and Yes Minister, and they're in charge for a bit. They'll be enjoying it.
Actually, that's a good point. Peter, can we bring you in here? I mean, are the civil servants talking to all the political parties and advising them on what they can do?
Once Gordon Brown has given permission for them to help with the negotiations. But they won't be at the moment. I'd be very surprised if they are. They will be, no doubt will have told the parties that rooms are available in the Cabinet Office for these discussions, or if they will prefer, the civil servants can come to Westminster or anywhere else. So the kind of logistics of it will have been talked about, but nothing more than that. And this is the great virtue, and Jonathan's always been very good on these constitutional distinctions between political appointees and the lifers, the career officials, and it makes it much easier in a system like ours, where you have, well, to sound faintly sexist, the continuity girls of the British Constitution have been there forever, and they have the precedents, and they have this bit of paper that was given to the Justice Select Committee at the end of February and so on, to make it more easier for people to understand what the rules are. But it's a great advantage to have a career civil service at this time, but it's only a very small number of them will be involved. And the Queen's Private Secretary will not be involved in the negotiations, but he'll be kept up to date, and he'll be on the phone to his boss or go and see his boss across the park to keep her up to date.
There are all sorts of gradations, aren't there, between being a minority administration and having a formal coalition. So there are kind of lots of ways of skinning this particular cat, aren't there?
Yeah. I think this is the first time where there's the possibility, at least, of having a proper European-style coalition with a common programme and all the rest of it, negotiations and what goes into it. Whether people want to do it in these circumstances is another matter, if they think another election's coming. But that may be that we're moving into a more European style of politics, which would be an interesting thing. The one thing I'd be cautious of, if I was doing this myself, is I would be very cautious about forming a coalition with a Northern Ireland party. Given my experience in Northern Ireland, I'd want to be very careful about taking sides in Northern Ireland at a delicate period when terrorism is still extant there. You don't really want to be on one side or the other. The great virtue of the British government has been being neutral in Northern Ireland.
Well, we were talking about the Lib Dem leader, Nick Clegg, a little earlier, saying he was disappointed with the Lib Dems result. There was this horrible phrase, Clegg-mania, that we were hearing about after the debates, which I think the Liberal Democrats admit didn't quite happen. And here's Nick Clegg arriving in London.
Yes, and there he is with his wife, Miriam, and his press secretary, Lena, who been with him pretty much throughout the campaign, and it'll be fascinating to know whether Nick Clegg has taken any phone calls on the way down from his constituency in Sheffield down to London. But you can imagine intense interest now about the position of Nick Clegg, and it's not quite the position that we'd all envisaged when the polls closed last night, because we were anticipating that he would be going down to Westminster with an awful lot more seats. He may have fewer seats, but he's got an awful lot of power now in shaping on deciding what happens over the next few days and who our next Prime Minister is and what the shape of the government is.
Which is interesting when you look at the figures, because at the moment the Liberal Democrats have 51 seats. They had 62 in 2005. So at the moment their share of the vote has increased by 1%. But as John says, they might have an extraordinary amount of power in determining who the next government and the next Prime Minister is.
And when you think of just how much anticipation there was and all the talk of it now being a two-horse race, it's between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and they've only put 1% on their overall share of the vote. It's kind of very small returns given for all the hype of Cleggmania that there was just a few days ago.
Just to let you know, the reason we're looking down is because we've got the plethora of information coming into us this morning about who's lost what, who's gained what, who's won what. 34 seats yet to declare. But as you know, if you've just joined us, we are in for a hung Parliament. We can go to our correspondent Matt Fry now, who's outside the House of Parliament, and he's been watching how the night unfolded. Morning, Matt.
Good morning, Sean. Well, here, the grassy knoll of Westminster College Green, filling up with people, befuddled journalists, confused politicians, everyone basically trying to read the tea leaves, and really nothing is particularly clear, as you might have gathered. But we're hoping to shed some crucial light on all this with Trevor Kavanagh, the veteran columnist of the Sun newspaper. Now, a few days ago, Trevor, your newspaper had a front cover that had David Cameron looking a bit like Barack Obama with the message hope. Someone this morning told me that should have been nope.
No. Well, Matt, what you've got today is an extraordinary situation where, despite the gerrymandering of our electoral system, one party has increased its votes and its seats and has the largest of both, but may be denied office by a coalition of two rather shabby parties who have lost seats and lost votes. And I think that this is a major commentary on our electoral system.
Well, I don't want to plug the Sun too much here, but today's cover was something like unelected, unwanted, unelected, and untenable. So basically, this is a lose-lose-lose situation.
It is. I think that all parties, all three party leaders, must be bitterly disappointed by their results. David Cameron, because he didn't win outright when he should have done by a mile. Gordon Brown, because he lost 100 seats and is now on a voting level of about the same or less than Michael Foot. And the Lib Dems, who were expecting to go up into three figures and have actually lost seats despite their superstar introduction of Nick Clegg in the TV debates.
So what does this say about the state of the British electorate, that you have this lose-lose-lose situation?
Well, I think what is completely wrong is the way that the constituencies are arranged so that a party like the Labour Party can win comparatively few votes but wins very, very large swathes of seats. And a Conservative Party, which despite winning more than Tony, or as many votes as Tony Blair won in 1997, is deprived of a clear mandate.
So what are the options now as far as you see them?
Well, I think the only option that would be sensible and decent and democratic would be for Nick Clegg to honour the promise that he made during the campaign, which is to support the party which had the most seats and had the most votes, and that is the Conservative Party.
I guess you would say that, wouldn't you, Trevor?
Well, we would, but I think that nobody can really deny that since he said it.
What about going with the Labour Party? That can't be ruled out at this stage, can it?
Well, a coalition between the Tories and the Labour Party, yeah.
No, between the Lib Dems and the
okay. Silly joke. No, I think that the question of supporting what is a busted flush as a government which wasn't re-elected, which has lost seats by about 100 seats in round figures, to support them in a return to power with a Prime Minister who was never elected in the first place and was certainly not elected today, I think would be a dereliction of duty on the part of Nick Clegg, who wants to appear a statesman now.
Right. And just finally, how quickly before we have the next general election?
Well, I think that most of the people around this place right now are talking about months rather than years, so we could see one by the end of this year.
Trevor Kavanagh from the Sun newspaper, thank you very much indeed. Well, you heard it there, months rather than years before all this happens all over again. Just imagine that. Back to you in the studio.
Matt Fry, thank you very much indeed for that. One result that's to bring you, it was a Conservative gain in Thurrock in Essex, and we can just see how tight that particular race was. Jackie Doyle-Price there winning the seat with a majority of just 92. Low turnout, just 50% there in Thurrock. So that was a Conservative gain, a 6.6% swing from Labour to the Conservatives.
Now let's bring in a couple of very interested parties here. Harriet Harman, Labour's Deputy Leader, and Ed Vaizey, who's the MP for Wantage and Didcot, very close to David Cameron. Welcome to the programme. We also have with us Lord Steele.
We almost forgot about you.
You crept in quietly, Lord Steele.
You were so stealthful. You just came in so quiet. Nice to see you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Well, let's talk to Harriet Harman first. Welcome to the programme. One has to wonder what Gordon Brown does now. Have you spoken to him?
Yes, and he came and met up with all the party workers this morning. I mean, obviously, our preference, our choice, would have been to have a majority Labour government. But this was not our decision, this is the voters' decision. And what the voters have decided is not to give us an overall majority, but they haven't given Labour an overall majority
either. Can I just
either.
interrupt you for a moment? The shots we're looking at are Nick Clegg arriving in central London. We just saw him get off his train. He's just heading out of the train station, as you can see there. I think St Pancras, if I was to hazard a guess, but I may be completely wrong about that, or King's Cross, and he'll be heading into Westminster along the way. And having gone into a tunnel, we've now lost his car. So that was worth interrupting you for, Harriet Harman. Sorry about that.
Where was I?
You were saying that the voters haven't given Gordon Brown and the Labour Party a clear mandate.
But nor have they given David Cameron an overall majority. And I think it's quite striking that after us having 3 terms already and facing a mammoth economic recession, a global recession, a political expenses crisis, millions of pounds from Lord Ashcroft, and all the written media.
People waking up this morning will be saying, are we still going to have Gordon Brown as Prime Minister? Is he going to attempt to form a government with other parties?
Well, I think that his obligation is, and it's his duty as Prime Minister, bearing in mind there is not a party with an overall majority whose leader can then go to the Queen and say, right, I'm going to form a government. It is his duty under the constitutional principles to actually see whether he, as Prime Minister, can form a majority of government.
So that's a yes then?
Yes, it's not his right, it's his obligation. He can't throw in the towel. He's got to see whether he can form a government, and he'll obviously need to be talking to the Liberal Democrats about 2 key issues. One is the economy and the other is reform of the voting system.
Ed Vaizey, your reaction to that?
Well, I think Harriet sounds completely balmy. I mean, it's just playing with words to say that somehow Gordon Brown is compelled to try and form a government. Gordon Brown lost this election. He's lost almost 100 seats. The voters have given a clear verdict. They do not want Gordon Brown to be their Prime Minister, and they do not want a Labour government. I think it's absurd to claim he's under an obligation.
The election. You started off with 350 odd MPs and a clear majority. You're now down to 247 at the moment.
Well, I think nobody's won it. That's the truth.
That's
but Gordon is the Prime Minister.
That's a different question. I was putting to you that you've lost it.
We've lost seats, we've lost share of the vote, but what we haven't done is seen David Cameron replace us as the largest party.
We have to interrupt you there. Sorry about that, Harriet Harman. Back with you, Ed Vaizey, and sorry, Lord Steele, in just a sec, because we are going to go straight to Downing Street now and speak to our correspondent, James Landale, who's there. James, what have you got for us?
Well, my understanding is that fairly shortly, Downing Street will be issuing a statement from the Prime Minister's office. Now, what we expect that to be is an explanation of the current rules as they currently apply, as Downing Street apply, as to what will happen now when negotiations begin between the parties over how or when a new government could be formed. And it is my understanding that the Prime Minister will formally authorise civil servants to begin to facilitate those talks. This is one of those bits of the rules that were drawn up by Gus O'Donnell, the head of the Civil Service, the Cabinet Secretary, to try and give some kind of clarity if this situation were to arise. And one of them was, look, when you have these kind of negotiations, can you have civil servants with all the parties to try and help them, to give them information, so that when they're negotiating over policy and things like that, they can do it with information to their hand and an ability to just smooth the talks. And my understanding is that that statement that will come from the Prime Minister's office shortly will formally authorise that that can take place. It is within the Prime Minister's gift not to authorise the facilitation of those talks by the civil service, but it's my understanding that the Prime Minister has decided to let that happen. Now, what do we conclude from that? Well, we conclude that the Prime Minister is not in any mood to throw in the towel, namely that talks are about to begin and he is prepared to help them be facilitated. In other words, we're very much at the start of this.
All right, James Landale, extraordinary stuff there from Downing Street. As you see, we're going to hear a statement from the Prime Minister shortly.
Yeah, and just before we get that and come back to our panel here in the studio who are waiting patiently, I just wanted to show you the scene at number 4 Cowley Street, which is Liberal Democrat headquarters. Nick Clegg's car is on his way there. Goodness knows how it's going to fight its way up to the front door. It's a very narrow street, Cowley Street, just around the corner from the Houses of Parliament. And there we see Nick Clegg's car making its way through the London traffic. And I wish I could work out more clearly whereabouts.
Mike Sargent, our correspondent, is in that scrum somewhere. Can you hear us, Mike? What's going on? No.
Yes, I can. Yes, I'm just standing outside Cowley Street crowd of journalists gathering rapidly here, awaiting the arrival of Nick Clegg. So you're following the shot of him driving through the streets of London, and so we expect him here in a few minutes, where he's going to say a few words to reporters.
Do we know what he's likely to say, or is it going to be a holding statement, do you think?
I think we might have lost Mike in that scrum, actually, so why don't we bring in David Steele? And do you know, David Steele, whether there have already been discussions between Nick Clegg and Gordon? There haven't been.
You do know there haven't been discussions?
There haven't been, and I think the most important advice was what Peter Hennessy was saying a few minutes ago, that all three leaders are very, very tired. They've had arduous campaigns. They should not be talking today. They should get some sleep, and they should start talking tomorrow. And I think that's the most important thing that they should do now. It's clearly a difficult situation for all three of them, and I think they're not physically in a position to make progress today. And I think the pressure from the media is wrong to try and say, come on, are you talking yet? They shouldn't be.
Right, but it is inevitable that there'll be a pressure, just not from the media, from the British public, who want to know who our next Prime Minister is going to be. And it is kind of, you know, however many years, 36 years since we were last in this position.
Well, that's true, but as everybody has now accepted, the Prime Minister is Gordon Brown, and it remains Gordon Brown until he decides that he cannot form a majority. That's technically the right position.
Can I ask, though, David Steele, if Nick Clegg does get this phone call from Gordon Brown saying, OK, well, I know we came second, but would you like to form a coalition with us? How will the Lib Dems see that? Because in the past, you look at what Paddy Ashdown was saying to Nick Clegg, look at how Ming got led up the garden path, look at the way he was led up the altar and nothing happened. There is a good deal of suspicion about a Lib Lab pact.
Yes, and also there's the problem that Lib Dem plus Labour together doesn't provide a majority, whereas Lib Dem plus Conservative does provide a majority. Now that puts Nick Clegg, I think, in a genuinely a very, very difficult position.
Great knowledge and wisdom of the party, what will the pressures and strains be within the Liberal Democratic Party about forming a coalition, some form of arrangement, whatever it happens to be, with the Conservative Party?
I think a coalition with the Conservatives would be almost impossible. That's my personal view. It's not a party line. I think it would be very difficult on policy grounds. An arrangement in order to deal with the financial crisis is another matter, and I think that's one possible option.
So you'd have a limited, and what would Nick Clegg, would you counsel Nick Clegg to say your price has to be some kind of referendum on electoral reform? Or
I wouldn't dream of counselling Nick Clegg, and certainly not on television. I think the immediate priority is financial stability. The second issue, though I have mentioned this in conversations with him before, is there must be a fixed term to any arrangement, whether it's coalition or whether it's just a parliamentary agreement. What's hopeless for the country is to have a party in government saying, oh, we're going to run for another election as soon as possible. That is a disaster. We've got to have, I would say, at least a 2-year period of stability.
Right.
So as we stay on these pictures of Nick Clegg arriving in London and going to Cowley Street, the Liberal Democrat headquarters, where he's expected to make a statement, say some form of words, although we don't know what they are. Let's bring Ed Vaizey back in from the Conservatives. And you heard what David Steele was saying there. Unlikely that the Liberal Democrats would work, in his view, with the Conservatives because they differ so hugely on policy.
Well, what I heard David say was that it would be unlikely that we'd have a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. And again, speaking personally, I'm not part of Tory High Command. I think that's probably right. But what Nick Clegg did say is that the party with the largest amount of seats and the largest amount of votes probably had the right to form a government. And I think that it's perfectly possible to have a Conservative minority government with an understanding from the Liberal Democrats that they would let that minority government pass essential pieces of legislation, including the emergency budget that George Osborne has talked about, and possibly cooperation on issues where we have agreement. Nick Clegg talked about social care. There's also common ground between us on issues like the environment, where we could actually pass some important legislation. And that's what I would envisage potentially emerging over the next few days.
Okay. Let's go straight back to James.
Sorry, David.
David Cameron will have to rethink his position on electoral reform. That's not an immediate issue, but it cannot be ignored after the results we've seen today.
Sorry to stop you there. We're going to go straight back to James Landell in Downing Street. James.
Well, if you remember, just a few minutes ago, I told you that we were expecting a statement from the Prime Minister. I now have it in my hands, and essentially what he's saying is that on the 2nd of February, he announced that he had asked the Cabinet Secretary to prepare the Cabinet Manual. That was the rule book, if you like, that I referred to earlier. And he says that he says the election results are likely to show there is no clear majority for any single party. As the Prime Minister speaking, said last night, said it is my duty as Prime Minister to take all steps to ensure Britain has a strong, stable and principled government. This is, of course, chiefly a task for politicians and in time for Parliament. He goes on, but to facilitate this process and consistent with the convention set out in the draft Cabinet Manual, I have asked the Cabinet Secretary to arrange for the Civil Service to provide support on request to parties engaged in discussions on the formation of government. So there we have it, formal authorisation by the Prime Minister for civil servants to attach themselves to the various parties in any negotiations that will now ensue as a result of the fact that we're in a hung Parliament. In other words, this is not over yet. This is just the beginning of a structure of negotiations that could last hours, but could certainly also last days.
James, for the moment, thanks very much. James Landau.
Let me just bring in David Steele at this point, because you've been there, done it, got the badge. Yeah. This is what happened in Scotland.
This is what happened in Scotland, exactly. The difference being, of course, that there's a fixed term in the Scottish Parliament, and that's why I've said that there ought to be a fixed term here, even for any kind of arrangement. But it worked in Scotland on 3 occasions, with 2 coalitions, 1 minority government, where the civil servants are certainly involved right away at the early stages. And James Landau is right. It will take days, not hours, and people should be relaxed about this. It's not going to happen overnight.
Just a reminder then, if you just joined us, Gordon Brown has asked the Cabinet Secretary to provide support to all parties engaged in coalition talks. But Harriet Harman, that isn't sort of an explicit, and I'm going to phone up Nick Clegg and ask if he wants to form a coalition government. Your understanding, though, is that Mr. Brown will seek to do that.
Well, I think that that's his responsibility to do that, and I think that it is a shock for people because they're used to waking up the morning after a general election and seeing either the same person in Downing Street or a new person going in. So it is a shock to people, but there's a way to go through this, which is actually to say, what's in this programme, what's in your programme, can we form an agreement which actually gives the British people a government which is in the shape of what they actually want. And because of our similarity of views on economic policy and because of our similarity of views on voting reform, probably the best way to do that, and we want stability, we don't want to have to plunge into another general election, probably the best way to do that is some sort of agreement with the Liberal Democrats. That's obvious, whether it's an arrangement or a coalition or a partnership, whatever you call it, that's what probably it's our obligation to seek.
Even if you do that, on current figures, you'll still be short of a majority. Even if you get the Lib Dems on side, you'll still be having to talk to other parties to try to get anything through. And won't there be voters who'll say, do we really want the second party and the third party forming a government?
Well, I think that's the situation the public's decisions have left us with, but that's not an impossible situation. We have to be mature, sensible about it, think about the public interest and try and go forward in a way and explain it as we go along.
Right, Harriet Harman, thank you very much.
OK, let us go to Belfast now, because we can speak to Lance Price, who was for some time a spokesman for the Prime Minister when it was Tony Blair. Lance Price, good to talk to you. What should happen now in your view?
In my view, although I agree with Harriet Harman that there's a vast overlap in interest between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, I think it's in their long-term interest to allow David Cameron to form a government, a minority government probably. And what, in my view, should happen is that Labour, Gordon Brown, should resign with good grace. I think if he tries to stitch up a deal, it will look like that. It will look like a stitch-up to the electorate. And that Labour and the Liberal Democrats should go into opposition, into a constructive opposition, whereby they would allow David Cameron to put a budget through, but both Nick Clegg and whoever leads the Labour Party would then do what they promised the electorate they would do and protect frontline services, use their voting power in the House of Commons to prevent cuts to frontline services. And if they want to do a deal, if they want to put something to the British people in terms of changing the electoral system, changing how we do politics, they should do it fair and square at another election in a year, maybe 2 years' time, having talked properly, thought it all through, but from the opposition benches as a constructive opposition.
OK, Lance, thanks. Very clear there. Let's just put that straight to Harriet Harman.
Well, no, I think the best way to have stability for the economy is to have a government which is going to protect the economy. And obviously we feel that our plans, not pulling the plugs on public investment, which is what the Conservatives would try and do, we think our plans are best placed to secure the economic recovery. So, I mean, what we've got is a majority of voters who didn't vote Conservative and a majority of MPs who aren't Conservative.
But to be fair, Harriet Harman, Conservatives have got almost 2 million more votes than you have.
Indeed, and we have not got an overall majority. You know, that is absolutely evident, but neither have the Conservatives. So
this is absolute nonsense. I mean, the last Labour government didn't have the majority of voters behind it, but it formed a government with a 60-seat majority. The voters' verdict is clear. We had an unelected Prime Minister who has now been voted out of office by the voters.
Unelected.
It would look appalling. It would look appalling if Gordon Brown remained as Prime Minister. And I cannot believe for a minute that Nick Clegg will prop up Gordon Brown as Prime Minister. It's just not on the table.
I don't know why the Conservatives keep going on about an unelected Prime Minister. We had 2 Tory Prime Ministers in my lifetime who similarly came to power without
Well,
an
he's
election.
just been voted out. I cannot believe that Nick Clegg will vote him in.
But you keep banging on about an unelected Prime Minister. We've had 2 Conservative unelected Prime Ministers.
Do you
It's
think Nick
irrelevant.
Clegg should support Gordon Brown as Prime Minister?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying what he should do. I think they've all 3 of them got a very difficult position. But another possibility, of course, is that Gordon Brown says in the next few days that he's going to stand down under the Labour Party rules in September, and meantime form a government. That is a possibility, so that he paves the way for a new Labour Prime Minister.
Do you think the what would the British public make of the idea of there being some kind of agreement between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats in which the British people have thought they were voting for Gordon Brown as their next Prime Minister, and they get, I don't know, David Miliband or Harriet Harman as the next Prime Minister? I mean, would that be acceptable?
No.
Well, we're in the situation we're in because nobody's got an overall majority, and it's not what people are used to, and it will take some time for people to grow accustomed to it. And people want, with the 24/7 media, they want instant results, and therefore I can imagine when people are hearing people quite sensibly like David Steele saying everybody should have a good sleep and then discuss it sensibly. Everybody's thinking, no, we want instant results, but actually that's not what the voters have left us with, and therefore we have to sensibly and maturely work out a programme. That's the most important thing. What's the programme on which a government can go forward?
I understand that point completely. I just wonder about the legitimacy of the idea. I mean, leaving aside that Gordon Brown was not chosen by the people originally to be our Prime Minister, the rules were the rules. It was exactly the same as that happened when John Major replaced Margaret Thatcher. Very similar set of circumstances. But what is different about this is that we've just had an election at which the head of your party has been Gordon Brown. He has been the person that the British people thought if enough people vote for him, they would get as Prime Minister. The idea of someone that the British people have never considered as Prime Minister within a week being their leader, that would have no legitimacy, would it?
Well, I think the legitimacy is if actually a majority of members of Parliament can agree on a particular programme. It's not the neat and tidy way that we've done it in the past, but it's no good the Tories just saying, give it to us, we want it, we think we're entitled to it. It's our turn now. I mean, it doesn't work like
you are
that.
saying that despite losing the election, that somehow you are entitled to carry on as a government.
That's the point. You
have lost
haven't won it.
this election.
But
But anyone outside of this Westminster bubble, anyone outside of this Westminster bubble can see that. Lance Price can see that. Lance Price talked quite a lot of sense just now. He can see what the British public can see, which is that Gordon Brown lost this election. And I think the public would be flabbergasted if Gordon Brown remained as Prime Minister of this
You're in danger
country.
of turning this into a presidential system, and it is not. It is a parliamentary system. And what matters, Harriet's right on this point, is who can muster a majority in the Parliament. That is the key issue. And that's what the civil servants will be dealing with over the next few years. It's not a presidential system. Who is the Prime Minister is, of course, hugely important in terms of the media, the press, the voters. We're all very interested. But it's not a presidential system, it's a parliamentary system.
Although, you see, voters might be thinking to themselves, you know, I've placed my vote, and yet all these discussions are going to take place behind closed doors. I won't have a say in it, and all of a sudden they're going to be presented with a government and with a Prime Minister that they might be happy with.
Well, but the fact is, in the end, they'll be presented with a government that can command a majority in Parliament. That's the point I'm making. And the fact that the results in so many seats were all over the place, as all the experts have said, shows that the impact of the television debates was not as great as people thought it was going to be. There hasn't been a uniform swing one way or the other. There have been individual MPs getting elected, and we've come back to a parliamentary system, not a presidential one.
OK, well, we can see the progress that Nick Clegg is making through the Friday morning traffic in London. He's just been along the embankment, and it can only be a matter of time because he's just about to turn right off Westminster Bridge and onto Parliament Square, I would say, at the moment, his car. So I would guess that once he gets around that particular junction, he's 1 minute away from the scrum in Cowley Street.
Well, let's hold there, because we are expecting him to make a few words when he arrives at Cowley Street, and go to Buckingham Palace and speak to our correspondent there, Nick Witchell. And of course, we don't know who's going to be Prime Minister, and neither does Her Majesty.
She certainly doesn't know. She's down at Windsor. There is an investiture there taking place. She's keeping away from this, but she will be listening intently through her private secretary and others, who is now down in the Cabinet Office. And she will be staying out of it, because at this stage it is up to the politicians now to sort this out, with the assistance of the civil servants, who are now made available to assist in this process, liaising through the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Gus O'Donnell, with the Queen's Private Secretary, Christopher Geit, and he will be reporting back to Windsor to the Queen. But at this stage, her priority is to remain above the fray, the political fray, the squabbling, which we've already heard there in the studio breaking out. She will, I'm sure, be concerned that we now have a potentially very divisive situation for the country, but that it is for the politicians to show leadership and have regard for the overall public interest in their negotiations, to try to come up with an agreement so that eventually somebody will come to the palace. In the first instance, of course, it will be Gordon Brown, and she will ask Gordon Brown in the first instance, are you in a position to form a government? Now, if Gordon Brown believes that he is, he will say yes, and according to the Constitution, he will then have the right to try to form that government. But clearly there is a lot of negotiation and discussion which needs to take place before we arrive at that situation.
Yes, Nick, is there a deadline to all this? I mean, how long can the parties decide amongst themselves who's going to be in government, who's going to be the Prime Minister, before they go to the Queen?
Well, the Queen's speech is scheduled to take place on May the 25th. That, in a sense, is the absolute deadline, but one must imagine that this is likely to take a number of days, and I think that all the advice that will be going to the party leaders is to take your time, as we've been hearing on the programme this morning. People are saying, look, calm down, let the dust settle, have a bit of a rest, because these are complex and hugely important issues. It is going to take some time to work through them. Let's not rush to any decisions. So it is likely to be, I think, clearly over the weekend. There is no absolute immediate deadline other than that, as I say, the Queen's speech is due to take place, the opening of Parliament, on May the 25th.
Nick, for the moment, thank you very much. Nick Witchell outside Buckingham Palace. Actually, interestingly, there are a lot of coalition governments in the rest of Europe, and they normally take 40 days on average to decide who's going to run the country.
I wonder whether our news agenda will be patiently waiting for all of that. Just while we're watching the progress of Nick Clegg towards, as you can see now, he's just going around Parliament Square. He's going to carry on down there, and then he'll turn right. I could give you the... He's going to turn right into Great Peter Street and then right into Cowley Street. There you are.
It's like having a cab
exactly. While we're doing that, let me just tell you about Brent North, Brent Central, I should say. I'm so sorry. Where we were waiting for that result. And it's a closely fought battle between Sarah Tether for the Liberal Democrats and Dawn Butler for the Labour Party. And it really has been a titanic struggle there. We understand from the press officer for the Liberal Democrats that the press officer believes that Sarah Tether has won with about a majority of 2,000. But that is still being argued over. That is why we haven't had a declaration for Brent Central. But Sarah Tether believes she has been returned to this newly reformed constituency with a majority of 2,000. Obviously, we'll bring you the result of that just as soon as we get it, and that will be some welcome news there for the Liberal Democrats. And there you can see Nick Clegg. Actually, he's going a slightly different route.
Is he?
Yeah,
It'll take him rather longer than we thought.
Yeah.
Interesting. We saw Lord Ashdown in the scrum a little earlier. Lord Ashdown, Paddy Ashdown said in the past we could not go into a coalition with the Tories. It would not work. A coalition is not an option for us. The parties are too far apart. And he's also said it's not unreasonable to think that where the party with the second highest number of votes forms an agreement with the party that comes third, the second place party would be the senior partner. So in other words,
and they're just turning into Cowley Street now. It's about this road will take a left turn in just a second, sharp left. There we are. Sad, tragic knowledge from your presenter here. Too much time spent camping outside party headquarters on previous elections, and now we can see Nick Clegg's car arriving outside Cowley Street. I just wonder whether he's going to say anything, so let's listen into this.
Nick Clegg, you've always said the party with the most votes and seats to form the government. Nick Clegg, are you going to do a deal with the Tories?
I can do. Thank you for coming in such small numbers to Cowley Street this morning. Last night was a disappointment for the Liberal Democrats, even though more people voted for us than ever before, even though we had a higher proportion of the vote than ever before. It is, of course, a source of great regret to me that we have lost some really valued friends and colleagues, and we have returned to Parliament with fewer MPs than before. Many people during the election campaign were excited about the prospect of doing something different. But it seems that when they came to vote, many of them, in the end, decided to stick with what they knew best. And at a time of great economic uncertainty, I totally understand those feelings. But that's not going to stop me from redoubling my efforts and our efforts to show that real change is the best reassurance that things can get better for people and their families, that it shouldn't be something which unsettles people. Now we're in a very fluid political situation with no party enjoying an absolute majority. As I've said before, it seems to me in a situation like this, it's vital that all political parties, all political leaders act in the national interest and not out of narrow party political advantage. I've also said that whichever party gets the most votes and the most seats, if not an absolute majority, has the first right to seek to govern either on its own or by reaching out to other parties. And I stick to that view. It seems this morning that it's the Conservative Party that has more votes and more seats, though not an absolute majority. And that is why I think it is now for the Conservative Party to prove that it is capable of seeking to govern in the national interest. At the same time, this election campaign has made it abundantly clear that our electoral system is broken. It simply doesn't reflect the hopes and aspirations of the British people. So I repeat again my assurance that whatever happens in the coming hours and days and weeks, I will continue to argue not only for the greater fairness in British society, not only the greater responsibility in economic policy making, but also for the extensive, real reforms that we need to fix our broken political system. Thank you very much.
Crucial statement there from Nick Clegg, with a clear indication of what his thinking is, that it hasn't changed, that the party with the most seats and the most votes should have the first chance to form a government, and that party appears to be the Conservative Party. Ed Vaizey is still here. Was that music to your ears?
Well, I think Nick Clegg, again, reflected what I was trying to say earlier when Harriet Harman was with us, which is I think there was a verdict from the voters. It may not have been as clear a verdict as giving the Conservative Party majority, but the verdict was that Gordon Brown and the Labour Party had lost this election. And that I think they wanted to give the Conservatives a chance to form a government. And I think Nick Clegg was reflected. I think what is important in what Nick Clegg said is that he means it when he says that we should have the opportunity to form a government in the national interest and that nobody should play politics. So I think it means that common sense decisions have to be taken about what legislation the Liberal Democrats are not asked to support but are asked not to stand in the way of. And for me, and I speak personally here, I'm not here representing the Tory leadership. I haven't had conversations with the Tory leadership. For me, it seems obvious that if there is a minority Conservative government with cooperation but not in coalition with the Lib Dems, it should be able to pass, for example, an emergency budget, which seems a crucial thing in the process of starting to get Britain back on its feet.
And David Steele, that does mean that in 50 days' time, the Liberal Democrats will be asked to support a Conservative budget that they might not agree with, or at least abstain.
Yes, I mean, as I said earlier, I don't really think that a coalition with the Conservative Party is on, because I think the policy gulfs are too wide. But some kind of agreement in the national interest would be possible, given the arithmetic. I mean, that could work. But getting that agreement, I think, would still be quite difficult. And as I said earlier also, David Cameron's going to have to budge a bit on electoral reform, if only to ask the people themselves what they want.
To get the support that they need in order to push through a budget, they're going to have to do something on electoral reform.
Well, I think there has to be the prospect that at least they would ask the people what they think.
Yeah, and Ed Vaizey, let me just come back to you, because we heard the second part of Nick Clegg's statement out there, that the electoral system is broken, it doesn't represent the hopes and aspirations of the British people. Clearly, the implication of that is that if there is going to be some kind of accommodation, and let's not talk about a pact or a coalition or whatever it happens to be, but some form of agreement, then Nick Clegg wants to see some kind of movement on that. How happy do you think David Cameron would be to give ground there?
Well, this is moving well beyond my pay grade, but I think that it is pretty obvious to me, almost speaking as an outsider, that if and when negotiations take place, and it seems to me pretty clear that Nick Clegg has issued an invitation to David Cameron to form a minority government and to negotiate with the Liberal Democrats over the next few days, after they've had the sleep that Lord Steele so quite rightly recommends, that there will be some very gritty negotiations about electoral reform. Now, that can take all sorts of different permutations, which I don't think I'm qualified to go into. I mean, speaking personally, again, we've talked about equalising the size of constituencies and so on, and speaking as somebody who is a member of a party that got, as has been noted in previous reports, the same amount of votes as Tony Blair in 1997, but didn't end up with a 197-seat majority, I can sort of see where there may be holes in the system.
Right,
I personally do not favour, personally speaking, proportional representation. I think that we would be having discussions like this every 4 years as a result of the proportional representation system.
You could ask the people what they think.
I think that may well be what.
And also, there needs to be a fixed term. What we cannot have is a Conservative government saying, "Well, let's just trim our sails in the hope that we can dash to the country again within 6 months."
Speaking as an outsider, my suspicion from hearing what David Steele says is that Nick Clegg will put forward a referendum as a proposal. I have no idea, I can tell you confidently, what David Cameron's reaction would be to that.
Well, you might agree to the referendum and say the Conservative Party is going to campaign against it.
Absolutely. Yeah. That is perfectly possible. But I obviously genuinely have no idea. That seems to be the likely thing that Nick Clegg will bring to the table in these negotiations.
The Liberal Democrats would support the Conservatives. So they promised a referendum on...
Not for me to say. I don't know whether Nick Clegg would regard that as sufficient.
All right, David Steele, Ed Vaizey, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Very much. We're going to go down to College Green now and join Andrew Neil, who has some guests with him who's listening to that. What do you make of it, Andrew?
Yeah, good morning to you. We've left the boat. We've grabbed a fresh shirt and tie, and here we are in the grass across from the Houses of Parliament. I tell you, there are enough cameras and technicians here to make a Cecil B. DeMille production, which is why we have two stars with us this morning of Her Majesty's loyal press. Danny Finkelstein and Jackie Ashley, welcome to you both.
Hello.
You heard what Nick Clegg was saying there. Did Nick Clegg just take the ball out of Gordon Brown's court and place it into David Cameron's?
He did, and he had no choice but to do so because of what he'd said during the campaign.
About how to define a mandate.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, during the campaign, it was never completely clear what he would do in this situation, and it isn't any clearer now. I suspect it's because he doesn't know. I don't think this is one of those situations when the politicians know something secretly and they're disguising it from the rest of us. I think they all really don't know what to do with the situation.
All right, so what would you advise David Cameron to do?
I think David Cameron's got to seize the initiative. I don't think he can work on the assumption that this doesn't matter, that the Conservatives, because they did get a big swing, because it was one of their best results for a long time, have therefore won a majority. They simply haven't, and they've therefore got to make compromises. And they've got
Such as?
They should. Nick Clegg has got 4 things that he said were important to him.
Which one should the Tories get?
Absolutely, they can deal with them on education. I suspect they can deal with them on environment. I'm sure there's a deal there to be done on tax. The breaking point, the big issue is proportional representation, electoral reform. And then he's got to challenge Nick Clegg at a time of economic crisis. Are you really going to bring down the government or refuse to form a government simply on that one issue? And Nick Clegg will then have a decision.
Jackie, actually, has Gordon Brown suddenly become a spectator for the rest of the day?
Well, I think we might have some very funny goings-on in Downing Street, because Gordon Brown has spent the last few months setting up this committee that's done a report to a select committee about what happens. They've got all the cabinet secretaries in there now trying to help them. And I think Gordon Brown is still motoring along this path that he'd been planning for some time. He as the incumbent, and they're talking a lot about his constitutional right. He's going to motor along that path with all the cabinet people and secretaries in there advising him that this is what the civil service think they should do. So it's going to be very funny if Cameron then comes in and says, hang on, I've got Clegg.
Unless I heard wrongly, then Mr. Clegg said he wants to deal with Mr. Cameron first, if he can.
Well,
because Mr. Cameron got the most votes and the most
But
seats.
the caveat was in the national interest.
No, he didn't even say anything about dealing with him. Actually, what he said is it's now up to the Conservatives to prove they can govern in the national interest. It was some way short of saying it's now up to them to say that they can put together a coalition with us or put together a deal with us. He simply said, so what he's simply saying is, can Cameron put together a programme that we can reasonably support?
So Mr. Cameron could go ahead and form a minority government on that basis and see whether Mr. Clegg's going to support him or
certainly
not.
think he can put the basis forward, and he then has to seek an assurance, I suspect, that Nick Clegg would support him in a Queen's speech, or at least not vote against it. The problem for what I call Clegg, for Brown and Clegg getting together, is they don't have a majority together. That's very difficult
But
for
if
them.
you read the second part of his statement was saying, you know, we have to have this broken political system fixed, i.e. PR and electoral reform. I can't see Cameron giving him that.
It's looking pretty broken this morning in every sort of ways. Let's head back to the studio, because I think we've got a result.
OK, Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Yes, I think we can bring you the declaration now from Poplar and Limehouse, a very keenly awaited result. I think we can bring that to you now.
679. Jonathan Harold Fryer, Liberal Democrat, 5,209. George Galloway, Respect, 8,160. Mohammed Aminul Haq, Independent, 167. Wayne Lochner, the UK Independence Party, 565. Kabir Mahmood, Independent, 293. Andrew David Osborne, English Democrats Putting England First, 470. Christopher David Smith, Green Party, 449. James Douglas Thornton, Independent, 59. And I hereby do declare, a number of ballot papers were rejected as follows. Wanton official mark, nil. Voting for more than one candidate than the voter was entitled to, 354. Writing or mark by which the voter could be identified, 23. Being unmarked or wholly invalid for uncertainty, 129. Total, 506. And I do hereby declare that James Fitzpatrick is duly elected to serve in this constituency.
So the Labour MP returned. Jim Fitzpatrick sees off the challenge from Respect George Galloway in that newly formed boundary there. So Poplar and Limehouse, Jim Fitzpatrick returned as the Labour MP after George Galloway changed his constituency after substantial redrawing of the boundaries there.
Yes, he was in Bethnal Green and Bow. You'll remember that victory against Labour's Una King in 2005. I think we can go now to Cowley Street in London, outside the Liberal Democrats' headquarters, because our correspondent Mike Sargent has Lord Ashdown with him. Mike.
Yes, that's right. Lord Ashdown is here with me now. Just a few words of reaction to that statement by Nick Clegg.
I am proud indeed. I am very proud to have a leader of my party who's proved today that he's a man of honour and integrity. He made a clear statement to the electorate, and even where some might argue that it wasn't in our benefit to do this, he has honoured his word. I think the biggest advantage we have got out of this last election, I wish we had votes to go with it, was respect, admiration and trust from the British people. Nick Clegg has today proved that trust, he is worthy of that trust.
Nick Clegg said he wasn't going to be the kingmaker, but today he appears to be choosing the Conservatives.
No, he isn't choosing the Conservatives. The public have chosen the Conservatives. Have you missed the election result? And the Conservatives do not have a majority to govern. They do not have a mandate to ram their manifesto down this country's throats. And I hope Mr Cameron understands that. He has a duty now to govern in the interest of the nation, not in the interest of the Conservative Party. Let's see whether he can rise to that. But Nick Clegg said that the party that has the clear mandate in seats and votes has the right to seek to form the government. He has honoured that pledge to the British electorate today, even when some might have argued that it isn't in his interest to do so. He has proved today that he's a man of honour and integrity, and I'm very proud of that.
So no talks with Labour?
Listen, it's not a question of talks with Labour. The Conservative government has the right to seek to try and govern this country. And if they govern in the national interest, and we believe that Mr Cameron has a duty to do so, that's where the situation currently stands. There were never talks with anybody, by the way. Mr Cameron now has a real duty in this country to prove that he can accept his minority position and govern in the interests of the nation, not in the interests of the Conservative Party. Mr Clegg made a promise to the electorate in straight, plain terms. He has delivered on that promise today. He's a politician who can be trusted.
Was voting reform a deal breaker?
Listen, no, there's been no deal. There's been no discussions. The thing is very straightforward. It is exactly as he said it would be. There's been no discussions on any side. The party that has the clear mandate to seek to form a government in this country now has the opportunity to do so. Now, we do need voting reform in this country, and if you listen to that speech, you will see that what he called for was an alliance of all the progressive forces in Britain. Maybe we'll be in opposition to make sure that what Britain has very clearly called for, which is a clean-up of our electoral system, is now carried through. I think you could ask Mr Cameron, is he going to govern in the national interest, and you could ask Mr Brown if he's going to join that progressive alliance.
OK, so lots of questions for all the party leaders. Lord Ashdown, thank you.
Not for Nick Clegg any longer.
Thank you very much. Back to you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Mike. So Lord Ashdown echoing what Nick Clegg is saying. The public has chosen the Conservatives. It's up to the Conservative Party to show it can rule in the national interest.
But now, let us take you back through some of the extraordinary images of an extraordinary night.
We're being disenfranchised, and that's not on.
I think everybody's very angry.
Hear, hear.
Yeah.
Disappointing night for you, Mr Clegg.
The outcome of this country's vote is not yet known.
I believe it is already clear that the Labour government has lost its mandate to govern our country.
And I hereby declare that Caroline Lucas is duly elected Member of Parliament for the Brighton Pavilion constituency.
It is now for the Conservative Party to prove that it is capable of seeking to govern in the national interest.
When it comes to success, Jo Malone is the business.
None of it is telling me what the brand is, what the product is, and what it does.
She can turn small ideas into big-time brands.
I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us.
This is reality.
It's actually got 4 names.
3 more names than you need.
We want to rebrand the burger.
You've got to get into that room and you have to sell it, sell it, sell it.
A brand new series, High Street Dreams, starts Monday at 9 on BBC One.
Modern art, it sells for a fortune, but what's it ever done for us? Has it influenced the clothes that we wear, or the buildings that we live in, the cars that we drive, even the way that we think?
Modern Masters continues with Matisse, Sunday at 9 on BBC One.
Now on BBC One, Election 2010 with David Dimbleby.
Welcome back to the BBC's election studio. Well, politics is in a real pickle this morning. Everybody's up and about saying what they're doing, all because of the way that we as a country voted. Quite clear what happened, which was that the Tories did much better than any other party. They didn't do as well as they hoped, but their popular vote went up. They're 2 million or so ahead of Labour. They've got more seats than Labour. Labour fell back, and the Liberal Democrats, for all that they were going to make this great breakthrough, didn't do that at all. They went backwards, if anything. Let's just have a look at the seats so far, just to remind you. There are still 31 seats to declare, but here are the figures. At the moment, the Conservatives are on 291. That's up 92 on the election of 2005. Labour are down 86 on 250. The Liberal Democrats are on 51, down 6, and others on 27. And on the share of the vote, and Nick Clegg, speaking a quarter of an hour ago or so, repeated what he'd said before, that the Conservative Party has most votes and most seats. It's up to them to show they can rule in the national interest, words which will be chewed over, of course. But here are the actual share of the vote. The Conservatives, 36% of those who went to vote, up 4%. Labour on 29%, that's down 6%. The Liberal Democrats up just 1% at 23%, and the others on 12%. So that's the overall picture. But there have been a lot of movement, because since we departed a couple of hours ago, we've had the statement from Gordon Brown, and John Sopel was dealing with this, saying that he'd asked for plans to go ahead, as had been arranged back in February, for deciding how a government should be formed. But the kibosh was rather put on that by what Nick Clegg said, I think.
Yes, I mean, Nick Clegg could not have been clearer. He said the party with the most votes, the party with the most seats, had the first right to try to form a government. So could not have been clearer in his own mind that he is going to be talking, first of all, to David Cameron and not to Gordon Brown. And I wonder whether that followed conversations between Gordon Brown and Nick Clegg, or whether Nick Clegg thought, actually, I don't need to have conversations with them. Although Nick Clegg did add that bit at the end about that it showed that the electoral system was broken, and that it didn't represent the hopes and aspirations of the British people. So I don't know whether he will join to that any demand from David Cameron that there is a referendum on electoral reform, or that there would have to be that as part of any kind of agreement, whether informal agreement to full coalition.
It would be weird, having put himself forward as the man who's taken this very simple if you like, straightforward view of this election. Look, chaps, it's perfectly obvious what happened. Gordon Brown got a bloody nose, and Cameron hasn't quite got enough to govern, but the Tories have done quite well. It'd be quite funny if he then started finessing it by playing games about what he was going to do and what conditions he'd make. I mean, he says it's up to the Conservatives to show they can rule in the national interest. Presumably, it's up to the Liberal Democrats and Nick Clegg to show they can rule in the national interest as well.
Yes, and I think there will be enormous pressure. And it's been interesting in the past sort of couple of hours of hearing that, look, everyone needs to have a sleep. Don't rush this. This could take days. It could take 40 days. You know, some people were warning. If you looked at the European example, I think there'll be pressure for something to happen more swiftly than that. And I think that actually what Nick Clegg said there suggests that Gordon Brown must realise very fast that as things stand anyway, even with all the Labour seats and the Liberal Democrat seats, there might not be a majority in the House of Commons, so that the Labour would have to bring others in as well as part of a coalition.
Is there, just before we go to the news, is there a possibility, in your view, that Gordon Brown might tender his resignation as Prime Minister today?
He must be considering that possibility. And when you had Peter Mandelson on earlier, he said this was a vote for change. And I think as the day unfolds, we'll see a little bit more clearly, probably, what that means. But I think at the moment, Gordon Brown is not going to rush into a decision. Harriet Harman here a little while ago saying, we've got to wait, we've got to pause, we've got to take a breath.
Well, we're going to take a breath with Sian Williams just to have a look at how things stand, Sian.
Yes, let's bring you bang up to date with what's happening at the moment with the time just after 11 o'clock. The general election has resulted in the first hung parliament since 1974. No one party has an overall majority, but the Conservatives are the largest party. In the last half hour, the Liberal Democrat leader Nick Clegg has said the Tories should have the chance to form a government. The civil service will provide support to the parties in the talks ahead. With the latest news, here's Ben Brown, a warning his report does contain some flash photography.
Enter the Kingmaker. Nick Clegg arrived at Liberal Democrat HQ this morning as hours, perhaps days of haggling and horse trading begin. He's disappointed with his party's performance, but now his dilemma is, does he do a deal with Labour or the Conservatives?
Whichever party gets the most votes and the most seats, if not an absolute majority, has the first right to seek to govern either on its own or by reaching out to other parties. And I stick to that view. It seems this morning that it's the Conservative Party that has more votes and more seats, though not an absolute majority. And that is why I think it is now for the Conservative Party to prove that it is capable of seeking to govern in the national interest.
Are you going to resign, Mr. Brown?
Gordon Brown may have lost this election, but he's back in Downing Street this morning and he's still Prime Minister. As for the Conservative leader David Cameron, there's been no sign of him since the middle of the night when he appeared at his own count. He couldn't claim victory, but he did say that Labour had lost.
I believe it is already clear that the Labour government has lost its mandate to govern our country.
The Tories failed to get the outright majority they wanted, but they did get the biggest share of the vote with 36%, 7 points ahead of Labour on 29, while the Liberal Democrats scored a disappointing 23, with others on 12. Turnout for this extraordinary election was high, up to 65%. Too high, it seems, for some election officials who simply couldn't cope. Hundreds of voters were turned away at 10 o'clock last night when the ballot boxes were closed up.
Should have got more staff in, should have got it more prepared, more staff, should have done it properly, everything.
If you're trying to wash your hands of it,
people missed out their votes out there, it's totally wrong.
But the election is from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m.
Those who did manage to vote caused a few upsets. The former Home Secretary Jackie Smith lost her seat in Redditch, having been mired in the expenses scandal. For the Liberal Democrats, one eye-catching casualty was the flamboyant Lembit Opik. Other notable results of the night included Caroline Lucas, who becomes Britain's first Green MP, and the BNP leader Nick Griffin, who was convincingly defeated in Barking and Dagenham. But for now, all eyes are on the Liberal Democrats. Their dreams of a breakthrough may have been shattered, but they may yet hold the political destiny of this country in their hands. Ben Brown, BBC News.
Well, we've got a declaration. Let's go straight back to David. David.
Thank you very much. Brent Central in northwest London is declaring this is two MPs fighting this one out. Dawn Butler for Labour and Sarah Tether, when I say MPs, former MPs, for the Liberal Democrats.
I, the undersigned, being the returning officer at the election of a Member of Parliament for the Brent Central constituency, held on the 6th of May 2010, do hereby give notice that the number of votes recorded for each candidate at the said election is as follows. Ali Shara, the Green Party, 668. Butler Dawn Petula, the Labour Party candidate, 18,681. Duale Abdi, Respect, 230. McCastry Dean, Independent, 163. Rajput Sachin, the Conservative Party candidate, 5,068. Tether Sarah Louise, Liberal Democrats, 20,026. If I could finish, thank you. If I could finish. Just so everybody heard the result clearly, that's Tether, Sarah Louise, Liberal Democrats, 20,026. Williams, Errol Ainsworth, Christian Party, 488. And I do hereby declare that the said Sarah Louise Tether is duly elected Member of Parliament for the Brent Central constituency.
So Liberal Democrats gain Brent Central from Labour. Sarah Tether, a doughty fighter who could have gone to an easier seat, but took this one on in Brent Central when her seat was abolished, fighting Dawn Butler, who was also an MP. Here is the vote, a majority 1,345. And let's just have a look at the change in Brent Central. Liberal Democrats got 13 percentage points and Labour down 9 percentage points. A huge swing from Labour to the Liberal Democrats of 11 percentage points. Let's just hear Sarah Tether.
Over the next few years, I will be able to repay the trust that people have placed in me. This has been an incredibly close and hard-fought election, as you would expect when you pit two MPs against one another for the same role. Dawn Butler has been my toughest ever opponent, and I want to wish her well. My priority has always been to be a good local MP, to serve the people of Brent, and to use the platform that Parliament provides to campaign for the issues that matter to people in Brent. I pledge that over the next few years, I will continue to campaign for better housing, for more money for local schools, and for fairer taxation. I want to keep this short because this has been a very, very, very long night. And can I thank the returning officer and for the staff for their forbearance over a very long evening? And can I finally thank my absolutely incredible team, for my agent, Peter Hannon, and Chris Lehman.
Sarah Tether, at her count, victorious in Brent Central. Andrew Marr joins us from Tory party headquarters. Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed, David. John Soper was saying to you a moment ago that things may start to move very fast, and he was spot on. Here, as I understand it, is what's happening. David Cameron is going to make a statement. He's above me with his close aides and advisors at around 2:30, in which he will explain how he intends to form what he calls a strong and stable government. Now, he has to make some pretty fast decisions, because according to senior Labour people I've been talking to, they have a proposition to put to Nick Clegg involving fixed-term parliaments, proportional representation for the House of Lords, and a referendum on the so-called AV voting system.
system. That is probably going to be on the table for Nick Clegg to pick up, and Nick Clegg said less than half an hour ago that he wanted to see a change to the electoral system. But Nick Clegg also said that he would talk to the Tories first. So he is waiting. The call may already have come for all we know, but he is waiting for David Cameron to talk to him and explain to him what sort of deal, what sort of arrangement might be on offer for a Conservative Liberal Democrat arrangement. Now, is David Cameron going to do that, or is he going to try to seek to govern with the minority parties, the Ulster Unionists and others? That is the decision that he is agonising about right now. He has the very top MPs who have followed him through his 5-year journey and his closest aides huddled together, working out exactly what they're going to do. And it's very, very fast now. It's accelerating all the time, this game.
Andrew, thank you very much. Well, that's absolutely riveting. So there's going to be a statement from David Cameron at 2:30. And as Andrew said, the Liberal Democrats have said that they think that whichever party gets the most votes, the most seats, if not an absolute majority, has the first right to seek to govern either on its own or by reaching out to other parties. And I stick to that view. So we'll see what happens. John.
Yeah, so this idea that he's going to set out this view on how he can seek to form a strong and stable government that acts in the national interest, which almost sounds as though it's picking up the words of Nick Clegg, of what Nick Clegg said in Cowley Street, that the most important thing is that it acts in the national interest and not for narrow party interests. And here you have, it almost begins to feel like there's some choreography going on here, or that there are people are talking to other people and that they are moving in harmony. And I do suspect that this is moving, starting to move.
Sorry, who is moving in harmony with whom?
Well, it sounds Nick Clegg comes and makes a statement. David, and now we understand from the Conservatives that he is going to answer exactly that point that Nick Clegg set out for him.
I mean, one thing is certain, that the Liberal Democrats are not going to, at least publicly, speak to Gordon Brown for the moment, until they've talked first to David Cameron.
Nick Clegg says, right, I'm going to put the bench, I'm going to put the bar here, OK? And the bar is that we've got to be acting in the national interest, in the interest of national unity and not narrow party interests. Within a few minutes of that statement, we hear from Conservative headquarters that David Cameron is to make a statement at 2:30, how he will set out how he will seek to form a strong and stable government that acts in the national interest. So it's, you know, Nick Clegg, yes, I hear what you've said. I'm going to be answering that at 2:30. Just listen in. I'll give you the answer there. Just one other thing to add to that.
Hang on, just before you leave that point, do you mean to say that you think it's all arranged and that will be a foregone conclusion?
No, I just said
will there be a process of negotiation subsequent to that?
I said there is an appearance of choreography,
yes.
And it just does seem to be moving with some gusto. Just one other point to make, David. I gather that Dawn Butler is going to call, and she was the person we just saw defeated there by Sarah Tether, is apparently going to call for Gordon Brown to step down as leader of the Labour Party.
She doesn't have much clout at this stage.
She doesn't have a lot of clout, and statements
it might
from
be seen as sour grapes.
And
yes.
statements from losing candidates have a history, shall we say, of saying, you know, it's the moment to vent your spleen.
Yes, it might have been more effective if it had been done before she was defeated.
Well, there were those who tried.
Emily, your lovely map.
Yeah, I was thinking Bob Marshall-Andrews. Didn't he sort of admit defeat and blame Gordon Brown before actually winning last time round?
Yes,
something
that's
like
right.
that.
Yes, exactly right.
Let me show you. The story of the night is the hung Parliament. What does that actually look like? Can we visualise it? Well, there you go. That's what the country looks like so far. And the odd thing is, if I step back for a second, looking at it from this distance, it appears that the Conservatives have won. Look at all this blue. A torrent of blue here. It seems to be pushing up. So why isn't that a majority for the Conservatives? Well, very simply, because Tory MPs tend to hold these rather large rural seats. I'm thinking of Ludlow, Herefordshire, Dorset West. These are the ones we're expecting to go Tory as well, but they haven't yet. Penrith, probably Hexham. A lot of these, the Lib Dems as well, are rather bigger in size geographically than they represent, whereas the Labour MPs are clustered around Newcastle, clustered around Manchester, Birmingham, London. This map doesn't really allow them the room, so I'm going to do something which makes every single constituency the same size. Now look at that. They're all the same size hexagon. You can see what's happened here. half of the country pretty much, the wash to the 7 is the saying, is blue, minus a lot of London, some of it's still not coloured in. They've started to make these inroads that have been so important to them in the north. They've started to make northeast gains, but look, very little in Scotland. They've just kept that 1 seat, a few more seats in Wales, but not enough really going on in the northwest of the country. If I take you back to the last hung parliament, 74, it's quite a similar picture. Can you see now why we're in this hung parliament territory? So again, the inroads here, at that time, there weren't the Liberals, if you like, to distract. Just a few dots around of the orange, the Liberals, now the Liberal Democrats. But the Conservatives, if I take you back here, and you'll see that very similar picture now, still have a few more dots to fill in, and these will be the ones that we're waiting to see if there's any balance of power that hangs in these ones. But now you get a sense of why this hung parliament territory is not actually as blue as all that.
Thanks very much, Emily. Well, we have a conflict now of intent, because we've already been talking about Nick Clegg saying that the Conservative Party has most seats and most votes, and it's up to them to show they can rule in the national interest. But a few moments ago, Downing Street issued a statement saying the basis for a deal with the Lib Dems exists, i.e. between Labour and the Lib Dems, with electoral reform and economic recovery at its core, and the Labour Party fully intends to take its first shout at forming a government as the Constitution allows. In other words, they're saying, well, we want to talk to Nick Clegg first, and Clegg is saying he wants to talk to the Tories first. And they say in Downing Street they won't speak to Nick Clegg until all the results are in, and they see this as crucial because the combined forces of the Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs would have to add up to more than the Tory total to have any legitimacy. So the story goes on, getting more intriguing as it goes. We join Jeremy Paxman now with his guests up in the gallery. Jeremy.
David, thank you very much. Well, I've got with me two former party leaders, Lord Steele and Lord Kinnock, and Sir Malcolm Rifkin, the Conservative MP. Now, Malcolm Rifkin, when David Cameron says that he's looking to form a solid and stable government, it must include the Lib Dems, mustn't it?
Well, when you say include the Lib Dems, I don't think there's any serious prospect for a coalition. A coalition has to have a joint programme, and I don't think it's unreasonable to point out that the Liberal Democratic Manifesto was, if anything, to the left of the Labour Party on this occasion, on disarmament, on taxation, immigration, and so forth.
But you
that's not the same.
Some sort of support.
Yeah, that's a different point. Yes, it is perfectly possible to reach an agreement if both sides want to try and find the basis of an agreement. I welcome what Nick Clegg has said, that he's honouring what he said during the campaign, that the first opportunity to form a government must be for the party that has most seats and most votes. And clearly the Conservatives are well ahead of the Labour Party on that basis. I think also David Cameron has a manner, has a style, and has a political position that ought to make it possible to reach understandings, particularly on how to deal with economic matters, because that's the fundamental question if we're not going to get some very serious reactions in the markets in the next few days.
If you were in Downing Street now, Neil Kinnock, what would you be doing?
I understand why Nick Clegg has made his statement this morning. He felt obliged to do that because of what he said during the election. And since it's not really within the government's control, then Nick Clegg and David Cameron are going to have to work out their chemistry. It's difficult to see how, with the strength of commitment in the Liberal Party to radical change in the electoral system, and equally strong commitment by the Liberal Party, particularly Vince Cable, to securing deficit reduction without destroying the prospects of recovery, how a deal can be struck with David Cameron that is durable, as well as honourable, and very transparent for the public. Those conditions have got to be satisfied.
And in the meantime, Gordon Brown just squats in Downing Street.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of squatting down.
What do you mean squatting down? Squatting?
Squatting. Well, that's the phrase.
Occupying the house.
That's the phrase, a colourful phrase that Nick used during the campaign. I don't know when he comes to reflect on that, when he's a very old man like me, whether he will regret or rejoice in having made those statements during the campaign. It certainly has put him in a corner that ideally he would not want to be in this morning.
Well, David Steele, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive,
Absolutely.
What
to be
a
young
position
was
to
very
be in.
happy.
Yes. I mean, to be in Nick Clegg's position now,
it's a hellish position to be in, actually. I don't think it's one that any of us sitting here would envy. And I agree with Malcolm. I think that it's almost impossible to imagine that there could be a coalition between the Conservative Party and the Liberals. Policies are too far apart. But what Nick Clegg has said is it's up to David Cameron to demonstrate that he can form a government in the national interest. Now that, frankly, means more than rhetoric. It doesn't mean a statement this afternoon, as we're now being promised. In fact, I think they should all go away and sleep and start again tomorrow.
Don't do any talking today.
I think it's foolish when they're all very tired to be trying to negotiate today. I really do. I think it's madness.
I'm just going to bring in Sarah Tether here, who we've just saw victorious in Brent Central. Congratulations.
Hello.
You look absolutely exhausted. You sound exhausted too.
Jeremy, I'm absolutely shattered. It's been the longest count you could possibly imagine. I don't remember when I was last in bed.
Now, what would you like your leader to do in terms of making alliances?
I'd like him to have a good sleep first, which is what I intend to do. I haven't got a clue, by the way, what the results are, because I've been locked in here for so long, so I've no idea what's happening outside.
Well, you've lost an awful lot of seats, and your leader says that he's going to talk first to the Conservatives and see if he can arrive at some accommodation with them, and then if that doesn't work out, presumably he'll talk to Gordon Brown.
Okay, thanks for updating me, Jeremy.
Well, such as it is. Do I paraphrase fairly, do you think, David Steele?
He didn't actually say...
No, David Steele, your former leader, will tell you more accurately.
He didn't say he was going to talk to the Conservatives. He said it was up to the Conservatives to demonstrate that they could form a government in the national interest. That doesn't mean he's talking to them.
That sounds pretty much what he's been saying for most of the campaign.
How can the Conservatives form a government in the national interest if it doesn't involve the Liberal Democrats?
Well, it would involve tailing. For example, let's take one policy example. If he says, I'm going ahead to have tax cuts for the very rich, that's not going to get Liberal Democrat support. So, you can go through the policies and say it's got to be modified in the national interest, not in the Conservative Party's programme interest.
Sarah Tether's main advice is that everyone goes to bed, as far as I can see.
That's my advice too. She's right.
I genuinely think a good long sleep before anybody considers anything. I mean, not all of the results are in, I guess. There are some people who are counting today. So we're going to need to see what the final result is and just get some headspace and reflect on what the British public have said.
All right, good night. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
I think it's
Malcolm Ruffin, you want to go on quickly.
Well, I just want to make the point that, we're assuming that it's all about legislation. Most of government does not involve new acts of parliament. Most of government goes on without the need to actually get a vote in the House. So that is the first part of the equation. The second part is that we will have to get used to the fact that on various non-crucial votes, a Conservative-led government will not win. Just as Barack Obama doesn't always get his legislation through Congress. It's not the end of the world. What is crucial, however, and why I hope they don't just go to sleep today, a statement has to go out to steady both public opinion in this country, but more important, international opinion in this particular respect, that there is a prospect of a stable government.
You've got a very quick, you've got 10 seconds.
In fact, I was about to say something very much like that, and it is that in the course of today, the leaders of those two parties have got to make it clear when they will come to a conclusion, because prevarication will cost this country enormously. And when they do a deal, if they do a deal, they've got to say clearly how long it's going to be and what conditions it will fulfill. Otherwise, we are inviting the very insecurity that must at all costs be avoided.
David Dimbleby is bursting to say something. David.
Thank you, Jeremy, very much. A correction, I think.
Yes, I think Dawn Butler apparently thinks that Gordon Brown is the right man for the job, so our advice that we were given, that she was going to call for him to go, and our great sort of dance down the route of other people who've been disaffected at losing their seats, not correct in Dawn Butler's case.
Jeremy Vine, that is not Paxman. Let's have a look at the new House of Commons and the shape of it, shall we?
Yes, because it's like a Rubik Cube this day. We're just trying to work out all the permutations and numbers that we've been left with are so fascinating. Let me bring on the MPs here, and you can see them, and the government benches. We put the Conservatives on, and you can see the winning marker here. We keep coming back to this number time and time again. This is what it's all about, 326, just over half the number of MPs in the House of Commons. That's what gives you an overall majority. And that is what the Conservatives have not got, according to our projections. So we count up the blue MPs here, and they're on 306, 20 seats short. That's our projection. That's where we think that they will end up remarkably similar to our exit poll at 10 o'clock last night. On the opposition benches, these are the numbers that we think will be in the House of Commons, and Labour, we think, on 261. Bear in mind, 349 after the last general election. That's a big drop for them. Liberal Democrat MPs just over here, again down 55 seats. And then the others, let's have a look at them, 28. So, looking at all of that, where does this leave us? What is the politics of the numbers inside the House of Commons? Let's take a look at our data table over here, which can allow us to just fiddle with the permutations, just take a look at the different numbers and see what might happen. And we'll start with Labour here. With their two, you can see the columns of MPs, 306 Conservative MPs there, the blue column, 261 Labour, and then the Lib Dems on 55, and the other parties, Northern Irish, Scottish, Welsh nationalists, the others and so on, much smaller numbers. So let's look first at this Labour column and just ask what happens if other parties support them. Let's take, for a start, the SDLP in Northern Ireland, who take the Labour whip, so we can put them happily in the Labour column, surely. 264 they're on now. You see the party join them at the bottom of the column. 264. Nowhere near the 326 they need for an overall majority. So you start looking around and you think, it's got to be, hasn't it, the Liberal Democrats. And notwithstanding what we've heard from Nick Clegg, let's just put the Liberal Democrats in the Labour column to make this point, that once that happens, they're on 319. 319, so they're still not on 326, even with the Liberal Democrats and the SDLP. And at that point, what do they need? Well, maybe they could say to themselves, Sinn Féin, the 4 Sinn Féin MPs don't tend to turn up at Westminster. They could do it with just a few, maybe a couple less than 326. Maybe they could bring in, this is a bit fantastical, bring in the Scottish nationalists as well, 6 of their MPs. Where are they then? 325. They've just about done it, but that looks like a pretty rocky coalition, not least because Nick Clegg has made it clear that his first thoughts are about the Conservatives because they've got the most votes and the most seats. So let's put them all back to where they were, and let's have a look at the Conservatives now. What can they do with this 306? They're not that far short, are they? They're over 300. They just need 20. They might start with the Democratic Unionists in Northern Ireland. 8 of those MPs, like-minded, surely wouldn't be a problem to bring them over into the Conservative column. They remain short. They're on 314, but they're getting closer. If they look across the other MPs here, the smaller groups of MPs, their eyes might alight on the others. Would that work? Well, one of them is an Alliance MP who took Peter Robinson's seat in Northern Ireland. She would be unlikely to join the Conservatives, more likely to join Labour. The second one, Sylvia Herman, now sitting as an independent unionist, has already turned down the chance of working with the Conservatives. So I don't think we can go to the others here. We may have to instead look again to the Liberal Democrats. It keeps coming back to the Liberal Democrats. The extraordinary paradox of this situation is that Nick Clegg has been pushed back in this election to 55 seats, but has ended up with more power. So once again, let's move the Liberal Democrats and see the effect of this. And now you see this blue column goes way above the 326 needed, 369. So if the Liberal Democrats did start to work with the Conservatives, not as a coalition, not as a pact, policy by policy, put in the DUP as well, they are in a very powerful position. And I'll actually show this inside the House of Commons now. You can see just how far over the winning line they get. Conservatives, Democratic Unionists and Liberal Democrats, where are they? Let's have a look down here. Winning line is 326. Just look further down for me. 369. So yes, that would do it. If the Liberal Democrats agreed, they would have the numbers. David.
Thanks, Jeremy. The tantalising complexity of stacking up a majority. We'll just hear about that a little bit more from Andrew Marr in a moment, who has some more news on it. But just before we do, seats that are still going to have to declare that are interesting. Bethnal Green and Bow in London. Buckingham we haven't had. It wasn't expected to come through today. That's the Speaker, John Bercow's seat. Nigel Farage of UKIP, who had this appalling accident in an aeroplane yesterday morning, won't be at the count, but was fighting John Bercow there. There's Cheltenham, Liberal Democrats, Tory are trying to take it. Norwich North, which is a Tory seat that the Labour Party is trying to get. It was a Tory at a by-election. And Westmoreland, which is another Tory target from the Liberal Democrats. So those are to come. But now I want to go and join Andrew Marr, who's got more information about this story, the developing story of the Tory attitude to talks with the Liberal Democrats. Andrew.
Yes, David, and it goes right back to those figures that Jeremy Vine was putting in front of us. A senior cabinet minister I was speaking to very recently said, it's perfectly obvious we can govern with the Liberal Democrats and we can offer them things on voting reform that the Tories simply can't offer. You then move over and you talk to the Liberal Democrats and they say it depends on whether the conversation with the Conservatives is, as they put it, grown up or serious. Is David Cameron going to give us something real? Now, I think the agonising problem for David Cameron is that if he tries any other group of smaller parties, which may very well be his instinctive preference, he is talking about those very parts of the country which he told Jeremy Paxman he thinks get too much share of public money already, too big a share of the state already. Those, the Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, those have to be all in his target when he is trying to get down this massive amount of public borrowing. So he is driven back towards the Liberal Democrats. I think the really big story for the rest of today is the nature of that conversation, and I would bet you that it's already started.
Do you think it began before this election result? In any way or not?
No. Not. I would have thought not, because I think that the Conservatives had a really optimistic thought that they could get an overall majority. A lot of people thought that as the night went on, more and more seats would start to fall into the Conservative camp. Voters would have turned towards the Conservatives right at the end of this campaign. And, you know, people in the Conservative camp were pretty optimistic about that. And I think it's only as this has developed throughout the night that it's become clear they are going to fall short. And therefore they have to look at this incredibly difficult, and from their point of view, very, very unwelcome conversation they now have to have with the Liberal Democrats. But the language on both sides does sound quite similar. Nick Clegg would find it very, very difficult, I think, to deliver a lot of his party for a formal coalition with the Conservatives, but he might well be able to agree a mixture of changes to the Constitution, the voting system on the one hand, plus some of the tougher economic messages the Conservatives have been putting through in the election. There'll be very, very difficult conversations about tax, very, very difficult conversations about the timing of government cuts, and that would be at the heart, I think, of any kind of possible deal.
Andrew, thank you very much. Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, has joined us, and Jeremy Paxman's talking to him.
Well now, Boris, what do you think about working with the Lib Dems?
Well, I think this whole election has been a brilliant example of the electorate coming up with a way of punishing all political parties more or less indiscriminately. I mean, they've kept the Tories, kept us from achieving an overall majority. They've exploded the great liberal myth that they were going to move into the centre ground and take over British politics, whatever they thought they were going to do. And they've delivered the most crushing rejection of Gordon Brown. And I think what we've got to do as politicians, what everyone's got to do is just get together and make sense of this. And I think the public will be in favour of anybody who can come up with a sensible Meccano-type solution. And I've absolutely no doubt that that is what is going to go on in the next few days.
Could you give us your own
hours?
Could you give us your own Meccano-type solution, please, Boris?
Well, it's pretty obvious if you look at what's happened, and obviously it hasn't completely finished yet, but Labour, I think, has been completely rejected. The Conservatives, by the way, have done incredibly well. You know, I know. I think I'm going to say this anyway, but it happens to be true that
you haven't got an overall majority.
We've got a bigger share of the vote than Tony Blair got in 2005. a bigger swing than Margaret Thatcher. You know, it's a fantastic achievement. And
if you can't get an overall majority after 13 years of Labour government and an unpopular Prime Minister,
I can see that, Jeremy. It is not a triumph, and no one should be remotely triumphalist about this. And that's why I think actually what Nick Clegg said just now was not half. It was sensible. I think you should look at something that will allow a stable, sensible government to be carried on in the interests of this city and of this country, and that's what we want to see.
And if the price of that is conceding or acceding to the Liberal Democrats' request for some form of proportional representation, price well worth paying, I'd imagine, isn't it?
Did you say is that a price worth paying?
Yes.
We'll have to see exactly what the price is and what the negotiations are. But I think the Liberal Democrats, from their point of view, will understand that the best thing everybody can do now is get together, sort this thing out as fast as possible.
I'm just mystified because if a system like that is good enough to gift us a mayor like yourself, how can you deny it to other people?
Allow David Cameron to get on and deliver a strong, confident government this country needs.
But why deny the rest of the country the marvellous system that has elected you mayor?
Well, you know, it's not for me to get into those negotiations now, Jeremy. I'm not going to preempt. I don't even have any reason to suppose any such negotiations are going to take place. All I think people want to see is a strong, successful government getting on in a confident way with the business of the country and moving on as quickly as possible from this withering rebuke from the public to all political parties.
Who will be Prime Minister by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, do you think?
Look, you know, David Cameron's going to make a statement at 2:30, as you know, and I think it'd be absolutely insane if we had a conclusion of this whole business that did not involve the Conservative Party, who have just won the largest share of the votes by far and the largest number of seats in Parliament, did not give the Conservative Party a dominant role in whatever structure we come up with, and you know whatever type of wall sausage is contrived by this great experiment. The dominant ingredient has got to be conservatism. The meat in the sausage has got to be conservative, I would say. There can be plenty of bread and other bits and pieces.
The question is whether it's a chipolata or a Cumberland sausage, I suppose, is it?
Fantastic. Listen, I think enough of this gastronomic metaphor.
You started it.
Well, I've had enough of it.
Haven't you got a city to run?
Say again?
I say,
I have got a city to run, and that's exactly.
Well, go and do it then. Goodbye.
The government of London will carry on, irrespective of the temporary difficulty in providing a national government. Thank you.
Bye, Boris.
Off to eat his sausages. There cannot be. I mean, this Friday morning, every single seat matters to the negotiations that are going to take place. We've got 29 constituencies, 28 of them which will declare this afternoon, barring loads of recounts. Two of them we just go to now. Nick Hyam is in Westmoreland and Lonsdale, a seat which the Conservatives are after. We've just got Nick Hyam, I gather. But Nick, what's happening? It's a very close-run thing, and it's 13th, I think, for the Tory target list. Do you have any indication whether they've got it or not?
I have no indication at all. Both the Conservative and the Liberal Democrat camps here remaining very tight-lipped, which suggests that they don't know either. 2005, the sitting MP Tim Farron snatched this from the Conservatives by a majority of just 267, which after boundary changes amounts to around 800 notionally today. He's up against a young Conservative called Gareth McKeever from Northern Ireland, who used to be a banker, in fact, an expert in Japanese equities for Morgan Grenfell, and the Conservative campaign did suffer something of a setback here in February when their party headquarters burnt down, taking with it all their computers and all their records. But Conservative activists locally apparently have rallied round. So the result now is too close to call, even though I'm told Conservative Central Office rather wrote this constituency off. Even though it's number 13 on their target list, they rather assumed that the Liberal Democrat machine locally was so strong that they wouldn't be able to take it back. But we've seen overnight very different results in Lib Dem Conservative marginals. It's extremely close to call here. They started counting at 9:30. We expect a result, barring recounts, by about 3 o'clock.
Nick, thanks very much. Charlie State is in Lancaster and Fleetwood. This is a new seat, part of old Lancaster and Wyre, and North Blackpool and Fleetwood on the coast there. What's the story there, Charlie?
Well, the story here this morning from the Leisure Centre here, we started the count at around 9 o'clock. We're sharing the facilities now with the local school kids who've come in for their morning lessons for their swims. Two counts taking place here. If you have a little look around now, the count's ongoing. In fact, we're only at a verifying stage at the moment. Let me tell you about Morecambe and Lonsdale first. This is a seat held by Labour. In fact, if we just look to my left here, you can see Geraldine Smith, who is the sitting MP there. She has a majority of nearly 5,000, but speaking to her a little earlier on, she's worried about the situation here. There have been suggestions that it could be a very tight race here. The Conservatives come in a close second. Lancaster and Fleetwood is the other count taking place now. In fact, geographically, the count is taking place over the other side. 60 people there, 60 people here doing the Morecambe count. This is a new constituency created from two former constituencies, one which was a Labour MP, one a Tory. So an interesting situation there. Of course, harder to know quite how that will work out. People are saying it may too be close. Now, I'm just looking. This gentleman here, you can see with his back to us at the moment with the glasses on, is Stuart Langhorne. He's the Lib Dem candidate for Lancaster. Can you see his pillow? He apparently had an accident in the bath. Saturday night we're talking about. It's painful when he laughs. He has to hold that because he's got a rib problem, although indications are here in Lancaster that the Lib Dems won't have a great deal to laugh about because it's not looking terribly good for them. Here, that's the situation. We're expecting results around about 2 o'clock.
Thank you very much, Charlie. John.
Very interesting about what you said about how every seat counts now on these remaining declarations. Because, I mean, Gordon Brown has said he's not going to start speaking to anybody until all the seats are in. Now, that's not because he wants a rest or he wants to sleep. I think it's probably because he wants to know exactly what the negotiating position is. And every marginal seat that Labour gains and, say, the Tories don't, then that means that the position, his position is strengthened a little bit. Let me just add one other thing that I've just heard from senior Lib Dem strategists. They're saying the ball is in Cameron's court now. The Liberal Democrats say they'll seek to use the influence they have to ensure that some of their objectives are met. But they're saying that the Tories haven't spoken to us yet. And asked about whether offers of cooperation from Labour are going anywhere, a senior source said, no, they're not going anywhere. So there we are. That's what's happening at the Liberal Democrats. And that is why all these last seats are so utterly critical when everything is as tight as it is.
I'm just trying to do the sums on this. There are 29 still to come. The Conservatives have 291 and are predicted to have 306. So they're due to pick up. Can you do that one?
So they're due to...
15.
Yes.
Beat you to it.
Yeah, exactly. but what it means is that, I mean, your people are slicing and dicing what legitimacy means now, aren't they? We were talking last night, all those hours ago, about it being a majority. Now it seems that what Gordon Brown is talking about legitimacy is if him combined with the Liberal Democrats have more seats than the Tories, then that is legitimacy, even though it may not be a majority in the House of Commons, which it won't be, because they won't get to 326 seats.
Correct. And so if our prediction is correct, the Conservatives should be winning 15 seats, Labour 10, and the Liberal Democrats 3. So that's what to watch for.
Exactly.
Andrew Neil is on College Green with his guests. Let's go over there, Andrew. Good morning.
Thanks, David. Let me begin by telling you something about this statement at 2:30. My sources tell me that Mr. Cameron and his people have been sounding out Conservative MPs and other leading members of the party this morning. They've discovered two things. One, there is deep dismay, anger, as one said to me, about the manner in which the campaign was conducted. And some leading Tories are thinking of going public about that quite soon. The other is that they've made it clear to him that they will not countenance voting reform as being part of any deal with the Lib Dems, and that will have to inform his statement at 2:30. If I get any more on that, I'll bring it to you. I've got three leading Labour people here. Una King, former MP, Charlie Whelan, the Lord Ashcroft of the Labour Party in terms of money, and Neil Lawson of the Compass Pressure Group. I thought it was a think tank, but it's a pressure group. Charlie Whelan, if Mr. Cameron says he's going to go ahead and form a minority government, and Mr. Clegg says, well, see if you can do it, what does Gordon Brown do?
Well, I don't think it quite works like that, does it, Andrew?
Tell us.
I mean, at the moment, Gordon Brown's the Prime Minister. I mean, with the Civil Service who will be conducting the negotiations, if you like, there'll be a team with the Lib Dems, a team with the Tories and a team for Labour. And that's how it's going to work. I mean, I know we've got 24-hour TV and some of your people are getting very excited, Andrew, but actually, you know, these things will probably take a bit of time.
Well, I know, it's an exciting time in our country's history.
I think we should just calm down a bit and let the negotiations commence.
Have the negotiations between Labour and the Lib Dems begun?
Not formally, no, but it would be astonishing, wouldn't it, Andrew, if there hadn't been informal talks.
Neil Lawson, are we in the last days of Gordon Brown here? Is the leadership contest about to begin?
Well, I think there's a great prize here for progressives in Britain. It's not about leadership, it's about
capturing that progressive alliance, that progressive majority. Because if you look at the hard figures, 53% voted for centre-left parties and only 37% voted for the Tories. Now, is this the moment where we can crystallise on a principle basis? Because if people want strong and stable government, you can't just do it around opportunism. You have to do it on principle. And we have to discover in the next few hours and days, is the kind of marriage between social liberals and liberal socialists one that can endure around a set of values and a programme? Sure. And the key thing in there is PR.
All right. Can it be done with Gordon Brown leading the Labour Party?
Well, I don't know about that. You know, needs must in politics.
You're with Compass. You know
needs
about the
must
Labour
in
Party.
politics. And Gordon has to do a deal with the Liberal Democrats, or he takes the party into the wilderness.
What if Nick Clegg...
And we know today that the issue is PR. And we were tribalist during the election campaign. Now, after the election campaign, we have to become pluralists.
Una King, what if Nick Clegg says, yeah, I get this thing about a centre-left progressive coalition, but I'm not doing it with Gordon Brown. He's toxic. You've got to give me somebody else. What should Labour do?
Well, I think the point is that Gordon Brown is the Prime Minister. Nick Clegg doesn't actually hold all the keys, because the problem with his strategy, I mean, this morning he has thought he's taken the initiative by saying to David Cameron, OK, you do it, we'll go with you, we'll give you the first chance, not Gordon Brown. But he can't get, you've just said yourself, the Tories are never going to come up with the Lib Dems' first demand, which is genuine reform over PR. Gordon Brown, on the other hand, is the man that has latterly, as someone who chaired the Labour campaign for electoral reform...
He's offering EV.
I'm saying he has latterly come around to the idea that we need to reform the voting system.
Are you seriously telling me that Gordon Brown can broker a new deal for a centre-left progressive coalition?
I'm not saying that. No, of
You're
course
not?
I'm
All
not
right, well,
declaring that.
all
But
right.
I'm saying I'm saying that Nick Clegg doesn't actually hold the keys to the Magic Kingdom.
So who could? Who would be better in Labour to do it?
I think that Gordon Brown could do it. I think there are many people in the Labour Party that could do it, because it comes back to this point that we have got progressive...
Give us a name.
You know who the leadership candidates are.
No, indulge me. Give me.
Oh, you've got
Who would
Alan
you
Johnson,
choose?
David Miliband, Ed Miliband, you've got Harriet Harman.
Give us the one you would like.
There are a lot... At the moment, Gordon Brown.
Oh, right, good and loyal. Tell me...
There isn't a vacancy, is it? That's the problem.
Well, there isn't for the moment, but at the moment no one's talking to Mr. Brown either. What should Mr. Brown give Nick Clegg?
Well, I'm sure he will give him electoral reform. I mean, after all...
Yeah, but so far he's not offering a system that pleases the Lib Dems, and they won't accept it.
Just let me finish. The Labour manifesto did have in a referendum on electoral reform, OK, AV. I mean, it wouldn't be a great
Alternative vote.
It wouldn't be a great step to put PR into that.
You think he might go further?
I mean, I know I live in Scotland. You're from Scotland. In Scotland, we get on fine in the Scottish Parliament with a single member constituency and a form of PR. And the Labour
Do you think that he should go and offer PR, Mr. Brown, proper PR?
Yeah, of course he should. It's an absolute no-brainer. If he doesn't, then we're in the wilderness for a generation. It's the chance to change British politics, and we could have a progressive century and not a conservative century. The prize is enormous, and there's one key decision.
Well, we shall see what happens in the hours ahead. Get a little bit excited, Charlie Wheeling. Just go with the flow. David, back to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Joining me here, Jonathan Powell, who is Tony Blair's Chief of Staff and was involved in the discussions with the Liberal Democrats prior to the 1997 election, correct?
Prior to and after the 1997 election.
What do you make of what's happening now? Do you believe Gordon Brown has a hand to play? Or do you believe that really, for the moment, the focus is on Clegg and Cameron?
I think Gordon Brown has a hand to play, but Nick Clegg is the one who decides who he dances with. He's the dancing partner. He gets to choose who to dance with. He decided his first partner is going to be the Conservative Party. He'll see what they have to offer, but he has a way back if he wants to the Labour Party, so he gets to choose.
It's a waltz or a quick step.
He gets to choose the dance.
Some very old-fashioned dance.
And even the music, yes, exactly.
And if he didn't have to dance with Gordon Brown, but was offered another partner, would that make things easier, do you think?
Well, he said some things during the election about that, but again, he has the whip hand in these negotiations at the moment, so he can dictate his terms to either side and see what they say to him.
If you were advising Gordon Brown, what would you advise him to do this afternoon? Apart from everybody says go to sleep, which is pointless. I mean, after he's had a sleep, what would you advise him to do?
I think you wait and see what the Tories propose, and if it's true the Tories can't propose proportional representation, he has one strong card in his hand, which he can play very effectively in the negotiations with Nick Clegg.
You heard what Andrew Neil said, that a senior Tory was going to break cover, saying, first of all, the conduct of the campaign was wrong. Well, so be it. People always say that sort of thing. But equally, they couldn't countenance voting reform. In other words, there'd be strong opposition Is that your information as well?
Yes, because there were various people who, during the campaign, the people that David Cameron defeated, shall we say, for the Conservative Party leadership 5 years ago, who are still pretty disgruntled, were muttering about the campaign more or less openly. Now, they didn't want to break cover during the campaign itself because they felt they, you know, if the Tories don't win, they'll be the people who will be blamed. They'll be the people vilified for daring to say that, you know, the campaign was going badly. But I think now they're going to play their hand, and the sort of some of the darker stuff that was being muttered. And, you know, the Spectator had very good sources as well on, there was a lot of disarray in the campaign, but they were just about keeping a lid on it. I suspect that will come into the open now. And it does show that David Cameron has got a limited amount of room for manoeuvre as well.
And Jonathan Powell, everybody remembers, and Liberal Democrats in particular will remember, the feeling that they were led up the garden path by Blair, that they were offered electoral reform, never actually happened. Do you think they'd trust Gordon Brown if they did come to negotiate with him and he offered the blandishments of electoral reform, four-year parliaments and all that? Do you think they'd trust him?
Well, I was part of the dance in 1997, and it isn't fair to say that Tony Blair led them up the garden path. We had discussions with the Liberal Democratic Party prior to the election and after the election. And what it fell down on is the issue that's arising now, again, which is proportional representation. In other words, in 97, from a position of strength, the Labour Party could have formed an alliance with the Liberal Democrats, but didn't do so because the proportional representation issue got in the way. Now proportional representation is on offer from the Labour Party, although not from a position of strength. And if the Liberal Democrats want it, that's their best hope of getting it.
So you didn't offer Paddy Ashdown PR?
No. At that stage, the Labour Party wouldn't accept. We offered them places in the cabinet.
I just want now I want to bring Peter Hennessy in, a professor of contemporary history or political history. I don't know what it is, but anyway, you've been with us before.
British history.
What?
British history.
British history,
Yes.
contemporary British history. What do you make of the present scene?
Well, it's wonderfully perilously poised because there's great bags of recrimination just above the head of each of the three party leaders, as John has been describing. And if that bursts to any degree today and tomorrow or over a period of a couple of days of negotiation, it's not going to help anybody. It's going to be very difficult. The degree of restraint that's required on the part of a lot of people is almost too much to ask for these days. It was extraordinary looking back to 74 because Jim Callaghan on the Friday afternoon said in the Labour Party National Executive Committee, we all agreed to say nothing over the weekend. Ted won't be able to do it. Let us leave him to swing in the wind. And unbelievably, the senior Labour figures kept mum throughout the entire weekend. Harold had the cameras in Buckinghamshire at his country seat, and all he was filmed doing was kicking the ball for Paddy the Labrador. Now, the world is different. We have electronic news gathering, people are breaking cover all the time, and you could almost feel those throbbing bags of malice above the heads of all three.
But there's been no hysteria yet. I mean...
you just wait a few hours, David. I may be wrong about that.
Nick Clegg seems to be cool as a cucumber still.
Yes, and he's been very cool, actually.
Well,
but I do worry about the frenzy breaking out.
All right, the two guests waiting to talk to Jeremy Paxman won't be cool as cucumbers if I don't go to them now. So, Jeremy, it's yours.
Yeah, well, we've got two participants in this latest game of political speed dating. Graham Brady is a Conservative MP, he's in Manchester, and Greg Mulholland is a Liberal Democrat, and he's in Leeds. Greg Mulholland, why on earth did you campaign against the Tories if you were perfectly happy to keep them in government?
Well, who's saying that we're perfectly happy to keep anyone in government? We haven't got a government, we've got a hung parliament. And what we all need to do now is to think what is the best thing for the country. And I think, you know, it might be fun for the media to talk about backroom deals, etc., but we need to look at where we can agree with any other party and where we can all work together. But it's for the Conservative Party as the largest party to come forward and say what they think should happen next.
So you can imagine a deal with the Conservatives, can you?
I can imagine a deal with any party that would actually take the country forward. And what is really important is not this other issue of should there be electoral reform or not. They clearly should. This electoral system is bankrupt. But what is most important to the British public is actually getting the economy back on track.
But I assume that you read the Conservative manifesto. You presumably know what they stand for.
And there are many things that we disagree with. I mean, that's the whole point of having a party system. But the simple reality is the British public have said that none of the parties, in their opinion, are worthy of a mandate on their own. So it's now over to us to do that. But it's for the Conservatives to take that first. But it's not a question of backroom deals and working out what might be in the benefit of the parties. It's what is actually the best thing for the country. And I think we need to be a bit more mature about this debate.
And should your leader come to the view that such a deal is in the best interests of both the party and the country, you would support him in that, would you?
Well, I mean, I think like most Liberal Democrat MPs, I would have my own views, and I will put those very forcefully. One thing to be absolutely clear, this is not a question of ping-pong conversations between any of the party leaders. There's a process here, and as part of the process for Liberal Democrats, the party has a role to play.
You've not answered a perfectly straightforward question with the word yes, or indeed no.
To what?
The question was, if your leader agreed such a deal, would you support him? Yes or no?
Oh, I've just explained to you that isn't how it works. It's not for Nick Clegg as our leader to agree anything on our behalf. It's for the party to decide if it's in the interest of the country and the party to do that. And if we come to that decision, then we will do so.
And you would expect, would you, that your party would, first of all, there be a parliamentary party decision, a national executive decision, and then we'd all have to wait across the nation while Liberal Democrat members took themselves off to Blackpool or Harrogate or somewhere for a special conference?
There'll be discussions this weekend, and of course, that's as it should be. But it's important not to go by the media agenda, the 24-hour media agenda.
I'm just quoting your constitution at you.
Tomorrow morning.
OK, Graham Brady, let me ask you. I mean, can you could see a deal being reasonably easily made with the Liberal Democrats, could you?
Well, I think what Greg Mulholland's right about is that we are looking at the electoral arithmetic as it's being given to us by the public. It's our duty to try to find a way forward. I think I would find it difficult to see a formal coalition with the Liberal Democrats, but not difficult to see a way that we could try to work, try to get legislation through, try to deal with some of the financial problems that we have to tackle.
And if David Cameron decided that he could only get the support of Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats by offering proportional representation, you'd go along with that, would you?
I would be very reluctant to see proportional representation. I don't think it's in the interest of the country, and I don't think that it works with our other constitutional arrangements. But obviously we're waiting to hear David Cameron's comments at 2:30. I actually have very strong confidence that David is going to want to be in the right place where the Conservative Party would want to be on these issues. But obviously we'll wait to hear.
All right, well, given where you are you happy with how the campaign was conducted?
The campaign, I think it's obvious for all of the parties, was affected by the leadership debates. It was something that all the parties had to respond to. I think we responded very effectively, particularly in the last week, 10 days of the campaign. I think we managed to get the message across quite clearly to the electorate.
Was it a mistake to agree the debates?
I think we've been pushing for these debates for many, many years. I think it would have been very odd if at the point that the Prime Minister said he was prepared to do it, we'd changed our minds. I also think it's been actually a very positive thing. One of the striking things, certainly in my count last night in Trafford, was the increase in turnout, up from 62 to over 68%. Significantly more interest in the political process. That is a good thing.
OK, thank you all very much. Thank you, David.
It's been reported by one of our political correspondents that David Cameron isn't expecting to meet Nick Clegg before this statement at 2:30, but more interestingly that the Tory sources aren't ruling out electoral reform, saying Mr Cameron will be constructive and do what's necessary to form a stable government for Britain. Well, we'll wait to see. Emily, let's just have a look. We've got how many seats to come? 29 to come.
Yeah, I want to go back to that phrase, the electoral arithmetic, and look at some of these white ones, the undeclared ones as yet. And the ones that we're going to talk about are the ones that really bring the maths into play here. For example, Westmoreland, a Lib Dem hold. Cheltenham has been Lib Dem for, and Bethnal Green and Bow. Let's go inside and have a look at them. So Westmoreland, a popular MP here for the Lib Dems, Tim Farron, who resigned from the front bench over the Lisbon referendum, or lack of. And it's a very close contest here. Just look at the swing that the Tories would need to take this. So less than 1% swing here. If I take us on to Cheltenham, a pretty similar situation here. This is one that is neck and neck. It would take very little to bring the Tories in here, Peter.
And the problem is, Emily, with both these seats, we look at what's been happening in these narrowly defended Liberal Democrat seats last night, and some of them went Conservative, and some of them went to bigger Liberal Democrat majorities. So who knows? And of course, the outcome, if the Tories win both, it affects the parliamentary arithmetic one way. If the Liberal Democrats hold both, it affects the parliamentary arithmetic the other way.
Yeah, to remind you, this is the 2005 show. We haven't had these results in. One more, which is very interesting. At least it was a big headline result last time round for George Galloway, sitting in the Respect Party. Bethnal Green and Bow. This time, Rushnara Ali is the Labour candidate, hopes to be the first female Muslim Labour MP. And let's just say, it doesn't really help to look at the swing, I suppose, but she could unseat the Respect candidate. There is a Respect candidate, but it's not George Galloway.
It wasn't George Galloway, and indeed George Galloway seems to have done worse where he has fought. Labour are pretty confident of taking that. It'll be the fourth Labour gain of this election. And may I make just one other, a train spotters point, especially for train spotters. People have been saying the swing to the Conservatives in this election is greater than Margaret Thatcher achieved in 1979. At the moment, it isn't. I say at the moment because Margaret Thatcher achieved a 5.3% swing. At the moment, with a few seats left, it's a 5.2% swing. And in 1979, what happened is the Conservative vote went up a lot, 8 points, Labour went down a little. This time, the Tory vote has gone up 4 points, Labour has gone down a lot. So it may be different at the end of the day, but at the moment it's not strictly true to say this is a bigger swing than Margaret Thatcher achieved.
Peter, thanks very much. Just with so few seats left, you can see the maths has kind of arranged itself through every little vertebra of each constituency.
28 to go. Jonathan Powell, just on the mechanics of this, are you cool about the way it's being conducted, or do you think it's going to become hysterical?
No, I think we should be a bit more relaxed about this. It may be new to us, but this happens in Europe and other European countries. After pretty much every election, you have to have a negotiation about who forms government. And maybe what's happened is we've just become a bit more European. Maybe this is not just a one-off, maybe we'll have this in the future as well, where you'll have parties having to trade off between each other.
But there is quite a fetish with keeping party unity in this country, where if you have a proportional representation system, you have more parties, and it's easier for them to move around and break away and form different shapes. I mean, quite clearly, from what we've been hearing from the Tories, for instance, the idea that the Tories might concede some sort of PR, proportional representation, is very obnoxious to them. They don't want it.
Well, party unity is not unique to Britain either. I mean, this is something that I was just talking to someone who had to conduct the negotiations in Austria between the Green Party and the Christian Democrat Party there. The problem they had was the Green Party couldn't agree with its members what it could concede, and that was where the problem will happen here too. The leadership may want to concede something, but they may not be able to sell it to their members, and that may be the problem we face
Greg
here.
Mulholland saying they've got to come, not up to Clegg to decide these things, up to us, the party, to decide
I heard similar
them.
things being said by the Tories about proportional representation. That may be where the rub comes.
Let's just go to Buckingham. Now, Buckingham, John Bercow's seat at the dissolution, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Nigel Farage for UKIP, taking him on. David Shukman is there. David, good afternoon, if it is good afternoon. It just is, yes, 5 minutes past 12. Good afternoon.
Yeah.
Tell us what's going on.
Well, the counting here behind me has been underway for about 2.5 hours now. The very latest we're getting from the team of John Bercow is that they are confident. They're using the phrase quietly optimistic. Early indications are that they feel they've done all right so far, and that really what you're left with is a battle for second place. By convention, the major Westminster parties do not put up candidates against the Speaker. That convention has been followed in this case, but John Bercow has faced a challenge from 10 independents and others, including the former leader of UKIP, Nigel Farage. Now, he, of course, was hoping to be here today, but instead is nursing his wounds in hospital up the road in Oxford. Some new details have emerged about exactly what went wrong with his great stunt yesterday, trying to tow into the air a UKIP banner to try to impress the voters of Buckingham. It turned out that what he was trying to do with a pilot was make a multiple series of attempts to collect this banner from the airfield, involving the light aircraft flying low over the runway. Apparently they made 5 attempts. Now, we're hearing this account from his campaign manager. Apparently, during this multiple series of attempts, Mr. Farage himself felt very, very nervous. The 5th attempt went horribly wrong. The banner somehow got caught up in the tailplane. The plane crashed, and as we know, pilot and Mr Farage both injured. But what is emerging during the course of the morning is more detail about exactly what happened. Mr Farage apparently saying he felt like he'd been hit in the chest by a train at the moment of the crash, and then lying in the wreckage he felt the aircraft's fuel dripping onto him, and told his campaign manager yesterday evening, "I really thought my time was up." Well, he's now in good spirits. He spent the night in hospital. He's not going to make it to the count here today. He will be watching on television. And as I say, the latest word is from the Bercow team is that they are sounding confident. So really there's a battle for second place here between Nigel Farage and the former Tory MEP John Stevens, battling for second place. We should get the result, we think, at the very, very earliest in about an hour's time, more likely about 1:30.
Thank you very much, David. And Geeta Gurumurthy is in Cheltenham. This is one of the top targets for the Conservatives to take from the Liberal Democrats. Geeta, what's the story as far as you can gather it today?
Well, I've just spoken to both sides, and the early indications are that, in fact, the Lib Dems might well hold this seat. That would be a victory for Martin Hallwood, who is the Lib Dem spokesman in the environment. Now, I must say that if you just look behind me, they have only just finished the verification process here. They haven't even started the official count. We're expecting a result at 1 o'clock. It is a very, very tight seat here. The majority here, of the notional majority, would be 316. It would be only needing a 0.3% swing from the Tories. They do have one of their top A-list candidates here, Mark Coote, an openly gay candidate. They've had a lot of Ashcroft money, according to his opponents, but it looks as though he might not have been able to win this seat for the Conservative Party. The Lib Dems candidate has also spoken to me about what would happen with this Lib Dem deal with the Conservative Party, for example. He says that if he wins the seat, he will be at a meeting tomorrow in London, he hopes, and the decision will be made on policy, he believes. He, off the record, obviously can't talk about anything further, but it seems fair enough to assume that if there is no deal on PR, that Lib Dems could support the Tories in some way, in a limited way, he says.
Geeta, thank you very much. Joe Coburn is in Norwich North, and this is a seat that was taken by the Conservatives in a by-election, Labour trying to take it back. Again, very interesting indications from Cheltenham there. What's your feeling about Norwich North?
Well, certainly a few hours ago it was too close to call, but I have to say we're expecting the declaration within the hour, and the Conservatives and the candidate Chloe Smith looking a lot more confident. It would be a very big swing to Labour if they were to take this seat. As you said, Chloe Smith, the young Tory candidate, won a decisive victory here last summer in that by-election. There were jubilant scenes for the Conservatives. David Cameron came down to celebrate that win, so they were certainly pinning their hopes on this seat, and that would really follow the trend across this region, because the Tories have performed very strongly across the eastern region. Really, Labour only holding those two seats in Luton. Charles Clarke, of course, in Norwich South, the former Home Secretary, losing by just a few hundred votes. So all the focus is here in Norwich North, and I think as far as the Conservatives are concerned, they may reduce, of course, that majority that they had, that 7,000 majority. But ironically, of course, this is still a notional Labour majority if the boundary changes that are currently in place had been so in 2005. Despite that, the Labour candidate isn't looking that confident. Of course, there is still about 45 minutes to go if the returning officer is correct, and we'll of course bring you that declaration, and then we'll have the result following. Broadland, that is most likely to go Tory. It is a new seat, but it will probably stay with the Tories, a majority there of around 5,000. That certainly is the prediction. But of course, one caveat: by-election victories are strange beasts. And if you remember, it was Ian Gibson, the popular Labour MP, the sitting MP here since 1997. He resigned suddenly because Labour said he wouldn't be able to stand for them again the election over the expenses, right at the height of the expenses scandal. That triggered that by-election, and as I say, Chloe Smith won that decisively.
Joe, it does cast an interesting light on the idea of these notional seats. I mean, while we're talking about it, it was a majority, according to the notional result in 2005, this constituency would have had a majority of 6,700. Is that disputed? by Tory and Labour, or is it generally accepted that is the accurate position?
No, I think it is accepted it's the accurate
Right.
position. I think the problem here for Labour is the fact that the swing back to them, even though they have that notional, as you say, this very strange term, that notional majority, would be really huge. And looking at the way it's gone here across this region, across the eastern region, the Tories have performed extremely strongly. It would, of course, be a very major upset if Labour did actually hold this seat, as it would be. But at the moment, it looks as if it's going to be a Conservative gain.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to getting that one. John Sopel, if John Bercow wins and goes back to the House of Commons, a dissolution, there was a lot of talk about how the incoming, I was going to say Conservative government, it's not an incoming Conservative government, the incoming membership, the House, would try and change him. Do you think they will, or is that now a trivial matter compared with all the other problems they've got?
I always thought that the possibility of that was slim. Would a new Tory government that's trying to govern in the interests of the nation as its first act in Parliament think, right, we're going to get Bercow, because we don't quite like him. He was never one of us. He was only put in because of Labour votes. And John Bercow is an odd character in that he's not loved by the Conservative Party. But I think it would be an extraordinary first act of a Conservative government to think, right, or a minority government to think, right, we've got to get the Speaker. I just don't see it happening. I think it almost seems like student politics rather than serious politics.
Hasn't happened since 1835, not swanking, I just have it written down here.
That was very good.
Yeah,
I tell you what, okay.
Charles Manners Sutton defeated by James Abercrombie.
And on speaker facts.
For real nerds.
Just one minor point. Douglas Carswell, who was the MP that played such a key role in bringing down the former Speaker, he's come out on his website and said something about maybe the Tories should embrace electoral reform.
OK, we're joined by Ian Watson, who has information from the Labour camp. Ian, good afternoon. What's the story that you have?
Yes, well, the senior sources inside Labour headquarters came out and spoke to us a few minutes ago, and they're saying that they're still very confident that potentially some kind of deal could be done with the Liberal Democrats. They're saying that when they're interpreting what Nick Clegg said this morning, he was very clearly leaving the door open. They wanted to point out his continued emphasis on political reform. And what they're suggesting is that because he said during the course of the election campaign that obviously the party that gets the most votes and the most seats, which is the first chance of forming a government, he had to have a consistent message with what he said during the campaign. But take a look at what he said. They're suggesting on electoral reform, and that is what they are willing to offer. Now, also very senior Downing Street sources are saying there is a basis for a deal with the Liberal Democrats, which would be based on electoral reform and also trying to get some kind of shared platform to get through the recession and into economic recovery. So from their point of view, they haven't ruled out any kind of deal. The fact that Nick Clegg said it's up to David Cameron to see if he can govern in the national interest means that, in effect, he's only doing what they suspected they would do, which is to talk to both parties. They still intend to talk to Nick Clegg, but they're not going to do so until all the results are in. And the reason for that is quite simple. They want to be sure that together Labour and Liberal Democrats could outvote the Conservatives, because clearly one thing it would not have, in their view, legitimacy is if they end up being a minority government, a minority coalition.
But that seems to be, I'm just doing the sums here as they stand at the moment, that doesn't seem to be too difficult. The prediction is that they will have between them, Liberal Democrats and Labour, 315, and the Conservatives will have 307. So that's a kind of phony hurdle they're setting up, isn't it?
Yeah, but as I said, one of the reasons that they're very keen to wait until every single result is in and not simply go on the predictions, because it actually comes very close to the position as to whether together any kind of coalition deal would be viable in any case. Now, they're not saying they need 326 seats, they're simply saying together would need more than the Conservatives would have. Obviously, there are going to be some minor parties as well, and Labour could rely, of course, on the support of the SDLP MPs from Northern Ireland, and they would expect the Conservatives to rely on support from the Unionists. So that's how tight it is, and that's why at the moment they don't want to go any further than what they've said already, which is that they believe that Nick Clegg is still keeping the door open. They believe that they are willing to talk to him about a kind of deal which would see electoral reform being delivered for the Liberal Democrats. But what they're also emphasising at this stage is that they will not have those formal discussions until after the final results are in. Now, obviously, the fact that Nick Clegg says that David Cameron and not Gordon Brown gets first choice as a potential suitor hasn't disturbed him too much if Nick Clegg has taken at his word and if he believes that political reform is the key to this.
Okay, and thank you very much. Well, keep us informed if there are any developments. There are bound to be developments, of the, particularly after David Cameron speaks at 2:30, which we're waiting for. I assume that the Queen will not be now coming back to London this afternoon. She was holding an investiture at Windsor Castle this morning, with a number of honours being distributed, the national anthem being played at the end of it. And she was prepared to come back from 1 o'clock today. And it's 3/4 of an hour before that, but unless Gordon Brown wishes to resign, there's no particular purpose in her coming back. So, and Queen there. You wanted to make a point about something or other. I can't remember what it was.
I think I've exhausted all my points. No,
really? Well, then I won't bother with it.
I'll make fresh points if you want. I can always kind of think of a point.
Fresh but non-exhausted. Go on.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Jonathan Powell, actually, when you were talking about what happened in 97, whether the Liberal Democrats led a merry dance and there was no agreement on proportional representation. What was Gordon Brown's attitude at that time?
I can't actually recollect the discussions with Gordon at the time. I mean, these negotiations were held very tight indeed between the Liberal Party and Tony.
Because John Prescott made absolutely clear he was opposed to any kind of deal. I just wonder whether Gordon Brown, at that stage, because he has been a late convert.
I mean, I think the problem was, at that stage, selling proportional representation to the Labour Party. The interesting thing now is that it's the Labour Party offering proportional representation and the Conservatives who are being chary about it.
Yes, I just wondered whether Gordon Brown was a rather tribal Labour politician. I just wonder what his attitude was.
The experience of Tony Blair and your time, Jonathan, you got the great Roy Jenkins to do the investigation for you, which bought you a lot of time, and he came up with the Alternative Vote Plus, which is what may be on offer from Gordon Brown now. But by the time that had happened, the steam had gone out of it, and I don't know what Roy felt about it. I suspect he didn't find it at all agreeable, to use his favourite word, that your old boss had led him down the garden path. He put a lot of effort into it. It was a wonderfully eloquent report, and I think this might play a bit now, because if Cameron, for example, offered a Speaker's Conference or another Jenkins-type inquiry to the Liberal Democrats, they might think very and justifiably that we went that way before with Tony Blair, and it takes forever and produces Zippo.
Yeah, and the times change in the process. So you're absolutely right. When we started down the process with Roy Jenkins's inquiry, the idea was to get to AV plus, and then to bring Liberals into the government and cabinet positions. But by the time we got there, it was too late, and it was clear that wasn't going to be saleable to the Labour Party.
They're not devils, but I mean, politicians, if they're wise, eat with a long spoon, don't they? You can't be too careful. Yes. Jeremy.
David, thanks very much indeed. We're joined now by Alex Salmond of the SNP. Alex Salmond, you're not by any chance already talking. Good afternoon. Are you not by any chance talking to anyone, are you, about possible arrangements to keep either Cameron or Brown in government?
Well, if I were Jeremy, it'd probably be unwise to discuss it in too much detail with you on television. Otherwise, they wouldn't talk to me again.
Well, I know that's not really an answer, is it?
Well, yes, of course it's not an answer, because that would be the point of having the discussions. The people can't have private discussions. I mean, Jeremy, we've been through this situation 3 years ago in Scotland. We're well used, and our colleagues in Wales Plaid Cymru have been through the same situation in the National Assembly. We're well used to this situation, and I have to say to you, making declarations or revelations on a television interview is not conducive to constructive discussion.
But there's no possibility of you doing a deal with the Conservatives, given they have such minimal support there, is there?
Yeah, well, if you want a straight answer to the question, I think you're absolutely right.
OK, and as regards the Labour Party, what would be the price there?
Well, as you probably noticed, I mean, we don't have the final results yet, Jeremy, but as you've probably noticed, the fate seems to have dealt us a mighty hand between ourselves and Plaid Cymru, since, as I understand it, on the projections we have at the present moment, certainly there would have to be some involvement of the SNP and Plaid Cymru if you were to get and construct an alternative government scenario. So for that reason, Jeremy, I'm accepting the offer of the Prime Minister on behalf of the SNP and Plaid Cymru are accepting to have the civil service back up to have discussions to see what the possibilities are in terms of defending the interests of Scotland and Wales in this parliamentary situation.
And what are you looking for?
Well, you know, that's why we have the accept the offer and have the discussions. Again, you know, I've been through this process in 2007 with civil service back up to discuss from a different vantage point, and that was in the formation that ended up in the formation of an SNP minority government in Scotland. And I know exactly how you should go about this, and it doesn't involve in showing too much of your hand before you have the discussions.
Thank you, that's very illuminating. We're joined now by two people who know a lot about coalitions, David Owen and David Steele. Who's in whose pocket in this arrangement?
Cheeky. Let's be serious.
Well, let's be serious. Yes, go on.
Well, I think Alex Salmond is not quite right there, because I don't see either David Cameron or Gordon Brown agreeing to any kind of arrangement which involves give us some more money, which has really been the Salmond cry throughout the election. I don't know if Malcolm would
give us some insights, David, as to how this sort of relationship works when you're trying to forge a common purpose and support each other.
I don't quite know what you're after. I mean, you want a serious discussion about a country that is facing a very, very great fiscal crisis, which none of the political parties, I'm not a member of any of them, have faced up to. And are you really sort of footling around with discussions with Salmond and the SNP? The issue for this country is, if you want a strong, stable government, it is open to David Cameron to talk to Nick Clegg. And if he does, they've got the numbers to have a government that can take us through this economic crisis, which is certainly going to last for 2 years and probably 3.
Which do you think is preferable, a deal between Brown and Clegg or a deal between Cameron and Clegg?
Well, you must think I'm an idiot to ask me that question. I mean, the basic facts are that the electorate have given a strong mandate, but not an outright victory, to David Cameron. So he has, obviously, the first port of call, he is holding the position of having the largest number of MPs and the largest number of votes. That is, by any standards, a starting point. The question is, can he widen that government out to involve others? Only he can decide that, but Nick Clegg has made it clear he will talk to him because he has got the strongest mandate, which Nick Clegg defined as having the largest number of MPs and the largest number of votes. So I don't know why the BBC is spending its whole time talking about the Labour Party and the Labour government. The issue is who is the electorate supported?
Because in the case of the occupancy of number 10, possession is 9/10 of the law at this stage, isn't it?
It is not, and it's a complete travesty of the Constitution to say it's 9/10. At the moment, Gordon Brown is a caretaker. He, I'm sure, will act honourably, and he is waiting for a situation to arise where he could resign, confident that there was a majority government capable of being formed. The issue is they've all said they want stable and strong government. Stable and strong government does not come on a minority government.
I'm going to have to cut across. There's a declaration here from Warwick.
At the said election is as follows.
Warwick and Leamington, held by Labour,
Bedell,
Conservatives
Alan
challenging.
Charles, Liberal Democrat, 8,977. Cullinane, Jim, Independent, 197. Davison, Ian, Green Party, 693. Lenton, Christopher, UK Independence Party, 926. Plaskett, James Andrew, the Labour Party candidate, 17,363. White, Chris, the Conservative Party candidate, 20,876.
Conservatives gain Warwick and Leamington from Labour.
And I hereby
huge turnout, 84% turnout, and a swing from Labour to Conservatives of 8.8%, nearly 9%. So Chris White, who fought this seat in 2005, takes it from James Plaskett, who's on the Treasury Select Committee, who's out, and there's the swing. So a Conservative gain in Warwick and Leamington. They've now gained 93. Good. What do you make of that one?
Fascinating the turnout figures again.
Very high,
just the variation, 84.5%.
Yes.
But I'm just interested in what's going to happen in the wake of the chaos that there has been in so many of these counts. That all this has been looked in. We were talking about the Jenkins review about how you kick something into the long grass, and we've talked about whether there should be polling stations in supermarkets and whether people ought to be able to vote on Saturdays when it's much more conducive to people having the time to go and vote. And I just wonder whether some of these things, it's all lovely going in there with, the plywood partitions and the stubby pencil, but I just wonder whether there isn't a better way of doing things. Although the good people of Warwick and Leamington have clearly gone out in force and done their democratic duty without too much trouble.
Let's have a look at Warwick and Leamington. Can we,
this was a seat that Labour just clung on to last time, 2005, with 266 votes. Since then, there have been boundary changes, and so you can see, if we go into that, what the Tories have taken this time around. Peter, I'm wondering how much the boundary changes have favoured any party. I mean, clearly it was designed to be particularly fair, but are we getting any sense of what that has done to one party or another?
On this particular occasion, the boundary changes helped Labour, or should have helped Labour. It made it slightly easier for them to defend it. They failed to do so because of the size of the swing. Across Britain,
have a look at that.
You see an 8.8% swing. Had Labour kept the swing down to 3 or 4%, which they have in many other marginals, they'd have held on to it because of the boundary changes, but they didn't. In other parts of England, the boundary changes have generally helped the Conservatives a little. It hasn't undone all the bias in Britain's political geography in Labour's favour, but it has undone some of that bias. But here...
John was mentioning this extraordinary rise in turnout there. I mean, a sense that people know when they're in a marginal, they are turning out?
They tend to at the end. When pollsters ask people with a week or 2 weeks to go whether people think they live in a marginal or a safe seat, they on the whole don't know. But as the day approaches, as the parties pile in with all the contacts, the phone calls, the leaflets, by the end most people do. And clearly they did in Warwick and Leamington.
Thanks very much, Peter. Talking about electoral reform, next time we're going to show you a very odd electoral anomaly, if you like, between two seats, same share of the vote, wildly different numbers of votes counted in each one. David.
I look forward to that. In the meantime, Jeremy Vine on Labour's share performance of the vote historically from number 10.
Yes, indeed, from our own interior of the stairwell at number 10. And let me make my way up the stairs. They have the portraits against the staircase. We're going to look up and we're going to see in context Gordon Brown's performance in terms of share of the vote compared to other Labour leaders. So, for example, here we have Clement Attlee, 1945. 47.7% of the vote, 146 seat majority. The majority is written underneath the pictures, as you can see. Nearly 50% of the vote. That's because the Liberals were not really at the races at this stage in British politics. Then 1964, same again. Harold Wilson, 44%. And a much smaller majority here. Big percentages, slips below 40 in February 74. Harold Wilson, as you can see, 37.2% there. And then October, the second election in 74, Harold Wilson again below 40%, 39.3%, and he gets a very, very slender 3-seat majority. And it looks as if Labour's vote, its share, is drifting away. You have Jim Callaghan, 1979, 36.9% of the vote. And then you get, in 1997, this extraordinary recovery with New Labour and Tony Blair, and 43.2% and a 177-seat landslide majority. So Labour then very much back in the game. The subsequent 2 elections with Tony Blair as leader, absolutely fascinating, because gradually the vote share drops. 2001, 40%, 165-seat majority, you can see. And then it come down even further in 2005, with Mr Blair winning with only just over 35% of the vote. 64-seat majority for him. So there you see down the staircase the various performances of Labour leaders. And if you're Mr Brown, look away now. How has he done? Well, the answer is today in the general election, 29%. So that's below all the other leaders we just mentioned in all the other elections we just mentioned. Where do we go to for a comparison with a Labour leader who performed that badly? We could go to 1992, never became Prime Minister, Neil Kinnock. Lost that election, 35.2% of the vote, still above what Gordon Brown got. The obvious comparison, I think probably actually, is this one, a very painful one for Mr Brown. Michael Foot, 1983, 28.3% of the vote. And it's something that, of course, hasn't been discussed too much yet because we've been busy with so many other things, but Gordon Brown's performance in terms of percentage share of the vote is very low in this election. And it's one of the reasons the argument is made that he cannot stay at number 10. David.
Jeremy, thanks very much indeed. Now let's go back down to College Green and join Andrew Neil.
Thanks, David. I heard David Owen telling us there not to talk about the Labour Party. We're always happy to oblige. We'll talk about the Conservatives. I've got the BBC's political editor to keep us right here. Good, Nick, to see you. I'm joined by Ed Vaizey MP. Wants me to tell you he won his seat by 52% of the vote, so he doesn't need electoral reform. Tim Montgomery of Conservative Home website, and Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator. Fraser, let me come to you first. Tell me the mood of the Conservatives as they come out of this campaign and head towards Mr. Cameron's statement at 2:30.
There is not very much happiness amongst the Conservative ranks. I mean, David Cameron has got the greatest swing since 1931, but he failed to get a majority against Prime Ministers as unpopular as Gordon Brown is and against a record as dismal as Labour's is. Everybody I speak to says we should have done better, we should have got the majority. The campaign seems to have reduced Tory support rather than increased it, and that the party is looking very weak now, because if there is a second election, and again, most of the Conservatives I speak to think there will be, probably next year, then think what David Cameron will have to do between now and then. Hideously unpopular things, which is going to make it even more difficult to get a majority next time around.
Is there a stomach among the Conservatives to do any kind of deal with the Lib Dems?
There is none, no. The idea, there's great sensitivity that some parts of the Tory party may want a PR deal which would create this sort of centralising consensus. The parliamentary party doesn't want anything to do with the Lib Dems. They broadly, if they had a voice right now, and they don't because there is no chairman of the backbench MPs group, if they did, they would be saying under no circumstances do we do a deal with the Lib Dems. It's got to be a principled minority government heading towards the inevitable second election.
Tim Montgomery, is it your sense, with Conservative Home you have unparalleled lines to the Tory grassroots, is it your sense that the party would rather see a minority Cameron government than any kind of deal with Mr. Clegg?
Absolutely, and we put a poll, started a poll of grassroots members this morning, and we've had over 1,500 replies to that survey so far, and we asked them, coalition or minority government, and it's 92% in favour of going alone and not joining the Liberal Democrats.
So there are 8% dissidents.
There's 8% open to this.
It's a divided party. You also told me during the campaign that you would tell me the truth about the Tory campaign once the election was over. Describe it to me in 2 words.
I can't do it in 2 words.
Well, take a sentence.
The issue, I think, is that the grassroots wanted a very different campaign from the Tory leadership. And the Tory leadership told us all they knew what they were doing. And we had perhaps our best opportunity in a generation to win an election. And we haven't won that election. And I think what we now need from the Cameron leadership is a much more open kind of leadership, a leadership that listens to the views of the broad cross-section of the party, because the party feels frustrated that the kind of campaign that they would have liked to have seen wasn't offered, and actually it's not been a campaign that succeeded.
Ed Vaizey, and because he didn't win the campaign, he has to listen now. When you win, you can do what you want. When you don't win, you got to listen.
Well, I think David Cameron's done very well, as you said. He's got this huge swing to the Conservatives, a fantastic result since 1931, and he's taken us to within spitting distance of a majority government. We said throughout that it was a big ask to go from where we are.
Should he do a deal with the Liberal Democrats?
Well, my view is that a deal is not on the cards, either from Nick Clegg or from David Cameron. I think there will be a minority Conservative government with tacit Lib Dem support.
Nick Robinson.
My sense here is there are a lot of Conservatives here illustrating the problem and illustrating in the phrase that was used in expenses, they don't get it. There isn't a Conservative minority government currently on offer. They don't have enough votes to do
Let me just interrupt you, Nick. Let's go straight to the result at Bethnal Green in Bow.
Votes recorded for each candidate at the said election is as follows.
And this is the seat which George Galloway stood at last time
Labour
round.
Party candidate.
And
21,780.
There's a new Respect candidate standing here in place of George Galloway, who lost, incidentally, his seat in Poplar and Limehouse.
21,784. Farid Packard, the Green Party, 856. Patrick Brooks, Independent, 277. Mahmood Chowdhury, Independent, 100. Hasbit Hikmat, United Voice, 209. Zakir Hussain Khan, the Conservative Party candidate, 7,071. Ahmed Abdul Malik, Independent, 71. Geoffrey Christopher Marshall, the British National Party, 1,405. Ajmal Mazroor, Liberal Democrat, 10,210. Abjol Mia, Respect, 8,532. Alexandra Reen van Terheven, Pirate Party of the United Kingdom, 213. The number of ballot papers rejected, 662. Ballot papers included.
So this is a Labour gain, the third Labour gain of this election.
Turnout.
And Respect no longer has a seat in the House of Commons.
And I hereby do declare
They've
that
gained
Bashara Ali
Blaenau Gwent, Chesterfield and Bethnal Green and Bay, those three. So Labour take that seat back. Let's just see the figures. Majority of 11,500, a very hefty majority. Not a particularly big turnout, but 10% up on what it was, 10 percentage points up on what it was last time round. Majority of 11,574. And the change here, and this huge fall in Respect, that figure, the 20% drop, 20 percentage point drop in Respect is George Galloway's vote when he stood here at the last general election in 2005. He said he wouldn't stand twice in this place. And a swing of 14.1% from Respect to Labour. The Conservatives have held on to Saffron Walden. Since we're short of results, let's just see that. We've got 25 to go. Alan Hazelhurst, who's a Deputy Speaker who sits in when the budget's taken instead of the Speaker in the House of Commons. His majority 15,000. And up 5 percentage points. Labour down 5 percentage points. UKIP up 2. So there we are. We might just have a look at one or two new faces that have come in with the Conservatives. Alan Hazelhurst is certainly not a new face, but Zach Goldsmith is in Richmond Park. The novelist Louise Bagshaw in Corby, the steel town. And Esther McVeigh in Wirral West. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, whose sister, Annunziata Rees-Mogg, failed to take the neighbouring seat, took North West Somerset, son of a former editor of the Times, Priti Patel in Witton, and Sam Gyama in Surrey. Surrey? Surrey. Sounds a very large place, Surrey, to be a seat. Surrey East, is it? Which Surrey was that, I wonder? Oh, well. I'm not sure. Surrey East, I think it was, yes. Well, now, I've been joined here by one of the most distinguished figures of British political coverage, of election coverage, Dr. David Butler from Oxford University, who has covered every election since 1950, who invented the whole concept of swing, which is actually known as Butler swing, who's written studies of almost every election, who I worked with the first election I presented way back in 1979. So he really is the guru of gurus on elections. David, I just want to ask you what you make of this result of this election.
Well, it's fascinating for a nerd like me and you who like elections and see it is an extraordinary result. It is has been a very odd story, the election as a whole. The result produces very difficult problems for all the parties, and one finds it very difficult to see how they can be solved with in a lasting way. And I'm afraid I have to, or perhaps I'm happy I have to say, that we shall see another election before very long, because I don't see the compromises that are necessary for an understanding, let alone a coalition, being made by the present parties, the rank and file, let alone the leaders.
Is this because of the eagerness to have another election to cap one that's uncertain. I mean, rather like Harold Wilson in
I think
74.
The 1974 analogy is a very strong one, and I think on the whole that if Cameron does form the next government, a minority government, he's got a very good chance, or in the past times would have had a very good chance of winning a clear majority on give them a fair go, a quick election afterwards. Unfortunately, at the moment, the economic situation is so dire that any new government getting in may very soon get itself deeply unpopular.
Is your view then one of pessimism about the British electorate? I mean, after all, everybody knows the problems we're in. People differ about the cause of it. That all three parties say they've got to be radical cuts in public spending and increases in taxation. And yet you're saying that the person who has to do that will become unpopular, as though we were all children and couldn't accept what it is that's got to be done.
Well, apparently it's the view that Mervyn King holds, and maybe a wrong view. I don't like to hold it because I'm naturally an optimist, and I think on the whole my fellow countrymen have a lot of good sense and they ought to be able to sort it all out. I can't say that I've been encouraged in that idea really by all the bromide things I've heard in the last 24 hours.
It's quite interesting. Rory Catherine-Jones has got some twittering and tweeting about the Liberals, and a lot of complaints, yes, about the possibility of the Liberals getting into bed with the Tories.
Well, what I've got, David, is a quick look at the blogs. We saw, heard a lot about Twitter. It's important to remember there are political blogs out there that are important. Conservative Home, we saw its editor. It's got a discussion already out there about PR and whether there should be some concession. Immediately, Christians Support Cameron says on this blog, we need to govern alone, our country requires it. PR should not be pursued under any circumstances. But by contrast, one perhaps lone voice here, Douglas Carswell, quite a right-wing Conservative, is actually calling for the party to consider electoral reform on his blog. So one voice there amongst the Conservatives. Amongst the Liberal Democrats, yes, they too, on their blog, Liberal Democrat Voice, are talking about this issue, but they're already unhappy, a few people, that Nick Clegg seems to be coming down on the side of the Conservatives. Big mistake, says one of them. Other people coming back and saying, this is very poor, we shouldn't be doing this. Welcome to savage cuts, somebody saying there. I have got a couple of tweets. I thought you were different, Nick Clegg. I thought you had fairness at heart. But somebody else, whilst I would have preferred a Lab-Lib union, I think Clegg has done the right thing. Love it or hate it, cons do have more votes. And just on one other tweet here, quite interesting, Sally Burko has been one of the most vigorous tweeters throughout this campaign.
The Speaker's wife.
The Speaker's wife, a very vigorous Labour supporter. She's turned up at her husband's count in Buckingham and she's gone quiet. No tweets from me for a few hours now. Listen to sighs of relief. Got to do the 1950s housewife, political wifey stuff. So there's Sally Burko.
David Butler, what do you think? You've seen all these elections in close-up. The principle of the argument of some different voting system, are you sympathetic to it intellectually? Do you think it's the right way for this country to go, or are you a first-past-the-post man?
I'm sorry, I'm terribly ambivalent about this. I think that the electoral system can't be justified, the present majoritarian system, if it doesn't work. I've never thought we'd get PR until we had at least 2 successive elections not producing a clear majority, which is the justification for the unfairness. But it is an unfair system. At the moment, it's unfair to the Conservatives. They needed about 7% more than Labour did in order to get a clear majority. It's unfair to the Liberals because when they're very close to Labour, they were still bound to get many fewer seats. So when it's very unfair, you can be indignantly pro-PR, but the trouble is, if you are pro-PR, it means that you have to accept we shall have minority governments with BNP, UKIP representation, other awkward minorities congesting the work of Parliament.
And Peter Hennessy, since we're on the point, what's your view?
I've always been torn, rather in the way that David is, because when you look at it in the most detached way possible, our voting arrangements are a rigged market. In an era of deregulation and competition everywhere else, we've had this rigged market. But there is also a historical argument for saying that clear, decisive majorities, quite often at times of crisis, are a desirable thing. And the problem we're facing today is that elections normally are a combination of catharsis and refreshment of the House of Commons. We're getting a refreshment of the House of Commons, but it's far from cathartic. It's a very, very scratchy result, which is making us very, very scratchy with ourselves. If we had a minority system, however, each time, we'd have to institutionalise it. We wouldn't have this bit of paper that I've been quoting endlessly from the Cabinet Office of the Palace and the Justice Select Committee. We'd have to have what Scotland has in the devolution legislation, a drill written out in legislation for how we handle uncertain results like this.
If you had it, could you try it out? Didn't France try it out and then abandon it? Could you try it out, and if it didn't work, I mean, we're a pragmatic country, supposedly, and if it didn't work, go back?
I'm sure that would become an issue of political dispute. I don't think you'd get a permanent solution for any electoral system. All electoral systems have their flaws, and different ones are suitable for different countries and different times. But at the moment, I'm afraid it is very difficult to come down firmly on one side or the other. They all have snags.
W.H. Auden, in his lecture at Oxford when he was made Professor of Poetry, said his preferred method of government was dictatorship tempered by assassination. And that one, with that, there can be no argument. That works. Let's join Jeremy Paxman.
I think we're joined now by Jack Dromey, who has just been elected in Birmingham and joins his wife in the House of Commons, his wife being Harriet Harman. Jack Dromey, what do you think of this idea of some sort of accommodation between your party and the Liberal Democrats?
Well, the electorate have spoken. What they want is stable government. What they do not want is a Conservative government. What's extraordinary about the results last night is that the big loser is the Conservative Party. We've been in power for 13 years. We've had the worst global economic crisis for 100 years. We've had the Tories pouring Ashcroft money into the marginals to try and buy seats. They were, the Conservative Party, 24% ahead in the polls, yet they have failed to gain a majority in the House of Commons.
They got 2 million more votes than you did.
The country does not want a Conservative government. What it expects
2 million
now...
more people want it than want a Labour government, apparently.
Yes, but the country wants stable government, progressive government, fair government. It does not want a Conservative government. And
well, then why did more people vote for it?
The verdict of the country is clear. If this was a Conservative country, and it is not a Conservative country, the Conservatives would have won a majority. The big losers are the Conservative Party.
The Conservatives got more votes than Tony Blair got in one of his elections.
The Conservatives have not succeeded in winning a majority in Parliament.
Well, thank you for stating the blindingly obvious.
The electorate does not want a Conservative government. The last thing at a time like this that the country needs is a Conservative government, not least because with their plans, Jeremy, for an emergency budget in 60 days, they'd make huge cuts.
Just to be clear about this, what they've really said is they want a minority government led by an unpopular Prime Minister who has failed to win an election, propped up by a party in third place. That's what the people of Britain really want, is it?
Discussions will now need to take place as to how we can deliver stable government in difficult times for the people of Britain. The outcome must not be, however, a Conservative government. And the Liberals are going to have to reflect upon this. Do they really want to get into bed with David Cameron? Because you've only got to come here to Birmingham to see what's happened as a consequence of a Conservative Lib Dem alliance in the council, cutting 2,000 jobs, services to the community. As a consequence, in Birmingham, the Conservatives did not make gains.
I think we've understood you. Thank you very much, Jack Dromey. Thanks.
Thank you.
So let's rejoin Jeremy Vine. Jeremy, if you're equipped and ready to go, are you in Downing Street or where are you now?
We are in our own Downing Street, David, yes. And do you remember at the very start of all this, which was, a long time ago, 12, 14 hours ago, we were looking at the Conservatives' paving stones, the seats they need, the 116 seats for David Cameron to get all the way down Downing Street to number 10. Each paving stone has the name of a seat on it, and as they won them, we've put them down in the street. So Dover is there, for example, and gradually they moved on a little bit further. Stockton South means they no longer have only one seat in the northeast of England. Pudsey, you can see the names on the paving stones. Chatham, Hove, down the street they came, winning these seats. We laid them out at first in order of difficulty. Now we simply laid them out in the order they won them in. And the last one, as you've just heard, Warwick coming in. And it leaves David Cameron short, doesn't it? He hasn't quite paved the whole way to the door of number 10. There's a bit of space between the paving stones and the doorstep. Now, our projections give him some more seats, so he'll close this space down even further. It's tantalising for David Cameron. Look how close he has got, but he's not quite there. He can't go up the steps and get to the top just yet as Prime Minister, and he can't really go through the open door because Gordon Brown is still in there. David.
Jeremy, thanks so much. We've had one call, not a particularly impressive one or powerful one, for Brown to go.
Yes, Jane Kennedy, former minister, former MP from Liverpool, Wavertree. She said that Gordon Brown should step down as he has not been seen to be able to communicate the message. We needed somebody who could communicate the Labour Party's vision and policy, and she says that he needs to stand down. Let me just add that Jane Kennedy was not a known lover of Gordon Brown and has expressed those sort of views before about his leadership, and seeing as she has stood down as an MP, maybe, you know, not the bravest, the kind of not in the front line saying he's got to go, not in the vanguard, I think it's fair to say.
Nick Clegg, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, has left Cowley Street, party headquarters, where he made his statement about Conservative Party has most votes and seats. It's up to them to show they can rule in the national interest. And whether he's on his way to meetings or discussions, who knows? Or maybe he's just going home to Putney to have a good night's sleep or a good day's sleep. Anyway, a man at the centre of attention, Nick Clegg, as a result of this election, which was a disappointment to him, as he confessed. Liberal number of seats fell by 5, or they've fallen by 5 so far, and the vote only went up a tiny bit, despite that euphoria. It's an extraordinary story, really, because everywhere you went during that campaign, people were saying, oh, the Liberal vote's going to go up, the Liberal vote's going to soar away. Everybody was talking about how everybody else was going to vote Liberal, and they didn't, or Liberal Democrats.
I mean, the percentage share of vote is up 1%, which compared to where we were and where we thought we were going to be is not it.
Emily.
Jeremy was showing you a second ago his paving stones. Why hadn't the Conservatives quite made it? And I'll give you an indication of why not. It's this extraordinary electoral analogy, if you want. I'm going to take you to 2 seats. The first was the very first declaration of the night. Bridget Phillipson winning here for Labour with 50.3% share of the vote. And let me take you on to another one where the result was exactly the same for the Tories. Nigel Evans winning with 50.3% share of the vote. But the difference, this man needed 26,000 votes to the Labour candidate's 19,000. Why, Peter?
There are 2 reasons, Emily. The first is that the electorate in Ribble Valley is quite a lot larger than that in Houghton and Sunderland South. 78,000 in Ribble Valley, 68,000 in Houghton. Despite the boundary change, which is supposed to make all the seats roughly equal size, they were operating on 2001 census data. So they're behind the curve. More shifts of...
Can the Conservatives complain that this is an unfair system, or is it just where they are winning seats?
It's slightly unfair in the sense that the Boundary Commission is always operating on old data, not on the best current estimates. But the more important reason is the turnout was higher in Ribble Valley. It was 67% as against 55% in Houghton. So the combination of higher turnout and a bigger electorate meant that the Conservatives need typically some thousands more votes on average in their seats than Labour needs in its seats. Now, 5 years ago, Labour got 36% of the vote and a 3-point lead over the Conservatives and had a clear 66-seat majority. Last night, or yesterday, the Conservatives got 37% of the vote, an 8-point lead over Labour. So they did better in the popular vote than Labour, but they're well short. And that's the reason why, because Britain's political geography is still stacked against the Tories. Can I make one more personal point? It's wonderful to see David Butler here. 44 years ago, but he was... his lectures inspired me to go into political number crunching. And I think if the new government wants to do something that nobody will object to and the union of number crunchers will applaud, it will be to give David the knighthood, which I think is long overdue.
And certainly, if Dr. Butler's right in his prognosis, we won't be dismantling this set anytime soon. David?
Right. Well, I don't know whether you heard that Iconium
Yes, rather embarrassing.
Very embarrassing. But nonetheless true. Let's go on, because we've got a few moments only before we go to the news. We're joined from Cardiff by Rhodri Morgan, who formerly First Minister of Wales. Thank you for coming to talk to us. Well, what do you think about
David?
What do you think about the state of play here in London and at Westminster? How would you be thinking? What advice would you give people about how to handle it?
Well, you have to take advice. When we were faced with a similar situation in 2007, I got on the telephone to Helen Clark in New Zealand a couple of times and asked her advice, and she sent her health minister over to Cardiff, who happened to be in London, to talk to the Labour executive about how to form a minority government with a coalition, because she told me over the phone, we just ripped up the Westminster rule book in trying to form a government. And I think there's going to be a lot of ripping up the Westminster rule book in facing this unprecedented situation. Now, obviously, David Cameron's in the pole position, but unless he can do some sort of a deal with the Liberal Democrats or others to get a Queen's speech through, then I don't think he can form a sustainable government, which is obviously desperately needed in the view of the, financial firestorm going on out there in the financial markets.
But Rhodri, what do you mean when you say you tore up the rule book, the Westminster rule book? Were you prepared to make a whole raft of changes that had never occurred to you when you were fighting the election?
Well, what you have to do, you have to allow civil servants to be guiding parties like the Liberal Democrats, who are conducting simultaneous negotiations with us, Labour, and with Plaid Cymru and the Conservatives to form an anti-Labour coalition. And in different parts of the Welsh Assembly government headquarters building, there were teams of civil servants bringing together special advisors and not the leaders, but the sort of very, very close to the leaders, senior politicians and special advisors, to see if the anti-Labour coalition could be formed and a Labour-Lib Dem coalition could be formed.
Was it a painful process for you as a politician? Did you have to eat a lot of humble pie?
Yes. Well, I mean, it took us 2 months and I finished up having a heart attack. But I mean, apart from that, it was very stressful, clearly. But we got there in the end. And we had time to be patient because we did not have financial responsibilities, nor was there a raging financial firestorm out in the international financial markets. But Nick Clegg is the critical person here, and Vince Cable maybe, because if David Cameron cannot form a sustainable government, it's no use him saying, I can form a minority government, I will dare the other parties to vote down the Queen's speech, and I'll call an election because I've got the money to fight the second election, and we know Labour and the Liberal Democrats can't. That's no good, because the Queen wouldn't then grant him a dissolution if the Queen's speech is voted down.
Rhodri Morgan, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for coming and talking to us and giving us those insights. And now it's time for the news, and we join Sian Williams. Sian.
And our live coverage of British